Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video I will be discussing and reviewing the recent Arrow Video 4K restoration of Sad Leone's masterpiece The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, the finale of the Dollars trilogy, and of course its release on the limited edition 4K UHD and Blu-ray sets, which are unfortunately now sold out, but the standard edition with the same feature discs and the bulk of the extras is available. This is of course a Region B import title, as Arrow does not have US rights. Those are still under Kino, but this is certainly one of the releases you go region free for because it is that comprehensive and gigantic of an improvement over everything that has preceded it, even though it is actually using the same Retrovada 4K scan that the previous US releases from Kino and MGM have used. This may also be the greatest example we now have of a third party going to the exact same materials that other entities have used and managing to correct and overcome virtually everything that was an issue with all previous releases of this scan and even finished masters of this scan. The work put into this release of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is even more intensive than the work that went into both A Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More, part of the same workflow with everyone else involved, meaning that Arrow Video went back and managed to get their hands on every bit of original material that they could, including obtaining and working on and presenting some of the long-thought-lost deleted materials, and even restoring and working on a complete version of the uncut torture sequence, not to mention actually providing ways to incorporate these into a branched version of the film, which has never been done before. But this means they had to work with both the Italian and American rights holders, access everything they could that was around in the vaults or that they could get a transfer of, while also working with the fan historian and preservation community as on the previous two films. So this is really the culmination of the whole Dollars Trilogy restoration project, and GBU being the biggest and most epic of the films, and having even more variations and problems and issues baked into its entire, not just video history, but its entire release history, not to mention the different cuts of the film and the different cuts of the cuts and variations of the cuts, because this stuff is madness. GBU is a much harder film to tackle than the other two films because there's just simply so much more to deal with, on top of having to still use the same Retrovada 4K scan that had the infamous color grading applied to it the first time around. So this is a project that had to not only try its best to restore the film as well as humanly possible with the materials that they could actually obtain and access, but also try to undo nearly 60 years of problems and release variations and video master problems and issues baked into past restoration attempts. So it was a gigantic project to tackle. That is really the key importance of this release, and what needs to be understood by anyone looking at the versions of the film that are now on physical media or trying to understand what this new Arrow release means. It is not merely a physical media upgrade. This is a complete restoration overhaul of not just the video masters of the film, but really its entire preservation status, trying to undo and fix and address as many things as humanly possible, and also including the historians and the fan community to try to make this as comprehensive a release as is possible. The only limitations, though, are that Arrow was denied access to be able to recreate the full Italian version of the film in terms of having the actual Italian version release edit with the Italian mono track. That was something they wanted to do on both For a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, have the actual Italian audio track, but that was unfortunately a decision that was reached by the Italian rights holders, I think, and so that was essentially, they basically, I think, changed their minds. And so on this release, we have the two primary versions of the film, the international release version, and then a longer version of the film that pretty much replicates the Italian release version and what was seen on the 2003 MGM extended English version, which was its own particular edit and not really a release version of the film. But basically, everything that's in the long version is represented here, but it's not 100% obviously the original Italian release version, because that was not allowed to be since they couldn't include the Italian mono track. Now, to briefly talk about the film itself, GBU is obviously the most iconic of the trilogy. It is the one that had the greatest penetration into the North American market. It was the one that was co-financed by United Artists and had the biggest budget, thus it is the most elaborate, the most epic in scale, and the one that has most crossed over into the pop culture landscape. Even the title itself has entered into general everyday language. You see it used everywhere. So it is a film that is immediately iconic in ways that the other two films in the Dollars trilogy are not. And in fact, it was the success of GBU that caused people to go back and see the other two films, because United Artists very quickly reissued them on a double bill, so people could actually catch the Italian westerns they hadn't seen the first time around, because the concept seemed weird and they didn't quite have the distribution or market saturation as GBU did when it was finally released here in the US in December 1967. As a film, and looking at Sergio Leone's body of work, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, or GBU for short, so I'll be doing that in this video multiple times, the film is at a crossroads. It is the end of the so-called Dollars trilogy, but it's also showing what will eventually come to fruition in Once Upon a Time in the West. It's a film of a thematic turning point. It builds on A Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More. It's more expansive, but it's also got a different flavor. It has a different visual style for certain reasons. It starts to stretch out time all the more, and it also has a different tonality in terms of how the humor is a much greater factor, and also now with a 3-character focus instead of just 2 characters and then just 1 before it, it has a different sweep. And so if you look at the films going chronologically, you can see how Leone grows as a director and as a stylist, but they ebb and flow into one another. And so GBU is the bridge between the experience of For a Few Dollars More and the experience of Once Upon a Time in the West, which starts the sort of next cycle of films, typically called the sort of Once Upon a Time cycle, or the America cycle of Once Upon a Time in the West, docusucker, and Once Upon a Time in America. Now, GBU's differences in terms of tone and style are for several reasons. One, because it's got a bigger story set against the backdrop of the American Civil War, so it takes on a somber tone in places and shows off even more of Leone's love of the history of the American West and also the Civil War. It's one of the most beautifully realized Civil War films ever made in terms of the attention to detail and production design and just the general authenticity of the feeling of the film. It's not 100% historically authentic, but I think it recaptures the flavor of the American Civil War like no film has before or since. What causes the greatest visual difference is a change in cinematographer. The first 2 films were photographed by Massimo Dallamano, and GBU, along with Leone's other films for the most part, would be photographed by Tonino Delli-Colli. And Delli-Colli has obviously a different style to Dallamano, and he's basically being instructed to go for more of an epic flavor to his visuals, because simply there are so many bigger set pieces and sets, and then even the gigantic battle sequence and the ending in the cemetery. So visually it's a more expansive film because it's a bigger film. And if you study the difference between how the two cinematographers approach Leone's style, particularly in the alternation of long shots and intensive close-ups using the Technoscope frame and spherical lenses, you'll see obviously that it's the same director and the two cinematographers are following his style, but they have different approaches to it. Delli-Colli's photography on GBU has more of a sense of grandeur. It is obviously a different sort of visual identity to the appearance of the first 2 films, and it's what GBU actually needed. I do think it does lose some of the intensive focus, the sort of smaller scale photography feeling as if it's focusing the story a little bit more, but GBU is an epic. It's a film that has our characters moving in and out of the American Civil War. It's a film that's extraordinarily varied. So having the exact same cinematographer and visual style, the first 2 Dollars films wouldn't necessarily fit this film. So I think it was a necessary thing to have at least some difference in the visuals. But it is important to note that there is a changeover in terms of the cinematography, and that does explain why this film is the one in the trilogy that has not only a different visual style, a different lighting style, but really a different visual identity, even though it's still got all the Sergio Leone hallmarks. Another major difference that makes GBU different and unique is that the writing sees others come in for the first time to the Leone canon. Leone himself gets a writing credit, but the primary writer was Luciano Vincenzoni, returning from For a Few Dollars More. But the other major writers were the team of Age and Scarpelli, who were a famous Italian screenwriting duo who were known for their biting satirical humor, especially political satire worked into comedies. They had previously written a film called The Great War, which featured two characters sort of having misadventures in and around World War I and as the backdrop, and a continual undercurrent of the showing and not shying away from the darkness of war. So that is a film that very much influenced their work on GBU. It's just obviously taking some of that concept and transposing it to the American Civil War. But it's uniting that flavor with a greater focus on humor, which obviously reflects in the Atuco character. It's uniting that with Vincenzoni's work and also Leone's story involvement that helps to unify this particular story and make it feel like it's part of the other two films, and thus we have the Dollars trilogy. Even though all three films are different, and there's arguments to be made about the actual order of the stories, and are they really sequels to one another or merely standalone films with the Eastwood character being sort of reflections or variations on a theme. In spite of their differences or how you like to watch them, they do fit as a whole. They do have thematic similarities that run through them. And GBU's greater sense of texture and having the other voices come in are what give you the refined and different undercurrent of humor that is similar but also different to the other two films. The film revolving around three characters now makes it the most complex of the trilogy stories, as it is building on the two lead character structure of For a Few Dollars More, but in ways it's also refining that structure, because For a Few Dollars More could also be looked at as a three-character film because you also have to include the villain of Indio. But The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly takes the potentially three-character structure focus of For a Few Dollars More and refines those further. We, of course, eventually get that realized in the characters of the actual title of the film. But if you examine the two films and their characterizations and the structure of the character arcs, you can very clearly draw a line between Indio and Angel Eyes and GBU. You can connect the two versions of The Man with No Name that Clint Eastwood is playing, although it does reveal that they are very different in their characterizations, which does play into the theory and also the idea or concept that GBU is a prequel to the first two films due to the Blondie character not being as fully formed or as above it all as the Man with No Name is in the other two films, but also that he acquires his poncho at the end of the film and the film takes place during the Civil War, whereas A Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More are clearly set after the Civil War. But also you have the Tuco character, who is not obviously heroic. He is the rogue, the scoundrel, the bandit, the character who is so rich and full of life that you can't help but love this scamp, even though he may commit acts of absolute evil. Tuco was the most complex character we had yet seen in a Leone film, and very much showed the stamp of Agent Scarpelli being involved in the actual writing and development of the film. But it could have very easily been a character that had gone one of two ways. It could have gone into full comedy, or it could have gone into pure outright villainy. But finding that balance is what balances our triangle of lead characters and what causes them to actually be equals. They reflect one another, and even though they may be named the good, the bad, and the ugly, they are all reflections of things in one another. It's why they form a visual triangle in the final duel, because they all are on some sort of equal standing, even if they may approach things differently. Clint Eastwood returns, this time as Blondie, who seems to be the younger version of the Man with No Name. And if you follow that theory, since the poncho is only acquired at the end of the film, and it seems that Blondie has to go through several trials to become more hardened and weathered by the end of the film, plus the Civil War setting. If you're following the internal sort of timeline chronology of the film's stories, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is then obviously a prequel that is set before A Fistful of Dollars is. So that would make For a Few Dollars More chronologically, in the way the film stories are, the last of the three to actually occur. Whether you agree with this style or not, Eastwood's performance is not only iconic, but completely unique, even compared to the other two films. Each of the characterizations of the Man with No Name is slightly different and unique to that individual film. So some fans look at the Dollars trilogy as variations on a theme, or individual stories that are reflective of one another, but they're not necessarily tied together as sequels. Eastwood's performance is also enhanced by being given some different things to do, as, again, you have this sense that the character is younger, maybe a little bit more brash. He gets in over his head every once in a while, but it's his cool resolve and his ability to outthink everyone else that keeps him alive. And so this gives the audience something different to watch and makes the film a fresher experience. So again, if you were to watch this film first in a rewatch and then watch the other two films, you'll notice that there's a sort of growth of the character into the iconic version by the end. With each film of the trilogy, the focus on Eastwood's performance became less and less, because he went from being the star of the first film to being the essentially a co-star of the second film, and then in the third film there are now two other lead characters. So one gets the sense that he was ready to move on, as he expressed at the time, and translate his newfound international stardom into something at the American box office. But this does mean that there's almost a relaxed quality to the performance that is different to what we saw in For a Few Dollars More. So it's important to note that each of Eastwood's three performances as the Man with No Name are unique to that individual film and perfectly suited. Lee Van Cleef returns, this time playing the absolute opposite character from Colonel Mortimer in For a Few Dollars More. Here he is just the pure evil Angel Eyes, or Sentenza in the Italian version, the professional who seems to enjoy killing, or at least enjoys being as proficient and as accurate as humanly possible, because that is his sole purpose almost in life. Van Cleef's presence alone is just stratospheric, so even his mere appearance in the film is unbelievably striking, and it means the character does not necessarily have to do or say all of that much outside of advancing the danger levels or advancing the plot forward more until the finale. It is still a very rich performance, though, because Van Cleef is able to create a sort of humanity even for this character, and it's remarkable and shows the actor's range at being able to play two opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of emotion and motivation in films that were back to back. So you see this film, and it's almost impossible to think of the same actor as Colonel Mortimer in For a Few Dollars More, and vice versa. But of course, the film belongs to Tuco and the performance by Eli Wallach, like what I think Van Cleef had in For a Few Dollars More and Eastwood in the overall trilogy. This becomes Wallach's performance of a lifetime in terms of his film career, because he's basically given the whole film to run away with. And the character of Tuco, the rogue and the rascal, is the one that was closest to Sergio Leone's own spirit. So there's a gravitation of the whole film towards this wild and irresistible force of life character. And it is, of course, Tuco who has the most obvious responses to everything that goes on. He is the most salt of the earth, even if he's wanted virtually everywhere for a litany of crimes that have to be read out on a long list every time. Other films would allow the Tuco character to just run away with the whole film, but interestingly, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly does not do that. Tuco becomes the lead character as he is the most expressive and the one that the audience comes to love and appreciate the most. But you also have to examine how the other two characters are maintained, and the three of them are always sort of jockeying for position because the ultimate goal is to get to Sad Hill Cemetery and get away with the $200,000 in stolen Confederate gold that's been hidden there. Of course, everything, including, the Civil War, intervenes. But it is Tuco's life force, his eternal frustration at being denied the ability to just get to where the gold is, of not having the full location, having only the name of the cemetery, but Blondie having the name of the grave. It's Tuco's reactions to the actual narrative of the film that provide the most entertainment, and is really why this is the film of the trilogy that I think very easily became the most successful and the most iconic, because it has the greatest reach in terms of audiences. It's the easiest film to watch for the first time and get on board with, because it has that greater sense of scope, and you have such a vivid, wily character for the audience to immediately identify with. It's impossible not to love this roguish character from his very first appearance. So it is remarkable how the film balances this. And while some, including some of the other actors, felt that Tuco kind of steals the whole film, that's also kind of the point of the film. The heart of the film is the Tuco character and the experiences he goes through and what that does to him by the end of the film and this pursuit of the stolen gold. So it means the other two characters are obviously not going to be as vocal, and so they may at times take more of a background position, but the film rather deftly jumps between the three characters and keeps them involved in the narrative, and also has a remarkable sense of narrative focus for what is a simple story with epic proportions and set amidst the American Civil War. All of this could have very easily been lost or squandered. And in fact, in the longer versions of the film, I do think that is actually something that starts to happen. I think the far superior version of the film is the 1967 international release version that Leone supervised and actually in ways did prefer, because it keeps the narrative focus. It is a tighter film, it is a better paced film, a better edited film, and while you do lose some really fantastic essential pieces, 99% of them are not really necessary, and while you hate to lose some of that, the international cut is the better film and a better structured film as well. GBU did have a significantly larger budget due to it being co-financed and produced by United Artists, who picked up the American rights. So it was UA, along with Alberto Grimaldi, who financed $1.3 million, so just over double what the budget of For a Few Dollars More was. This is why the film is able to be so much more expansive, because had it been the same $600,000 as For a Few Dollars More, it wouldn't have been possible. This is what allows Sergio Leone to firmly join the world stage in terms of the ranks of the great directors, because it's impossible to look at this film and not realize that it is one of the most perfectly directed films ever made. It is a pure experience that is larger than life and is one of the magical experiences of the cinema. It's one of the films that you show someone who has never enjoyed a Western in their life, and it will instill in them a lifelong love of the genre, because Leone was still paying tribute to the Westerns he adored and also the history of the West. So it is a film that you actually and truly experience, because it has this epic scale on top of all of Leone's artistry that was already there in his previous films. Here he's getting to get to that bigger stage and approach the feeling and sweep of a David Lean epic, but always in his own deeply rooted style. And if one could say that the previous two films in the trilogy were masterfully directed, but obviously showed they had lower budgets and they were Italian films, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is where you can no longer make that particular distinction, because the film has so even surpassed the ways in which it was actually made, even though it is still obviously shot silent and the audio is all post-synchronized and dubbed. It must also be stressed that GBU had another distinction in that this was the first Leone film to have the English translation done by Mickey Knox, the American expatriate actor who was living in Italy and was able to refine the dark humor of the Italian sensibility that was, of course, in the other two films, but be able to give the actual wording, the dialogue of the English dub, a little extra flair, which I think most of all assists the Tuco character to connect so deeply with American audiences. Basically, the actual dialogue of the English dub of GBU compared to the other two films has just that much more of an American flavor. It's got a little more refinement of the sardonic humor. And so because this comes across more in the actual wording of the dialogue that's spoken in the English dub, I think that has helped so many of the lines to become iconic as well. Along with this, Ennio Morricone returns and has his deepest collaboration with Leone yet, and produces one of the most iconic scores of all time. And it is their elevating of their own game over the past two films. Each film builds upon the other and builds in intensity and builds in ambition, but also builds in skill levels. So by the time of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Leone's vision and Morricone's music are so in unison that all of the strengths and growth that one had had, the other had had. And so this is one of those times where the music so perfectly meets the visuals that you cannot imagine one without the other. And it is why the film is such a supreme experience that demands to be seen and heard on the biggest and best screen possible. And of course, most of all in a theater. By the finale and climax of the film, after the incredible battle sequence, we have the ecstasy of gold and into the Sad Hill Cemetery for the final duel. And this final reel of the film is the supreme moment of unity of direction and visuals and music, because dialogue is practically non-existent for the entirety of the final reel, and one is hard-pressed to think of a better directed and executed single reel of a film, or 20 minutes or so, than the finale and final reel of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. This is the complete distillation of Sergio Leone's work in one specific example, featuring two of the greatest sequences in all of cinema history that completely obliterate the viewer in terms of the power of their visuals and sound and of course the overall impact. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is, simply put, one of the epic masterpieces of the cinematic medium. It is the complete and absolute sign that Sergio Leone had entered the realms of the greatest master directors and was a force to be reckoned with. Not simply someone making extraordinarily successful Italian westerns in Europe, but someone who was making films that the rest of the world would also have to reckon with, and were very successful, as the film immediately took fire at the US box office when it was released in 1967. The film's impact was immediate, and its influence on pop culture overall is so extreme that it remains one of the handful of westerns that is used to signify the entire genre, and is the most famous and most iconic of all of Leone's films. It is really the gateway for most people, myself included. It's usually the film that you see first of Leone's work, and it is such a transformative experience that then you become a Leone fan and you're just desiring to seek out his other films, because you have to know the whole world of the Leone film canon after seeing this one film. It is a supreme work of art that is larger than life, yet also beautifully focused around our three characters, and a simple story that weaves its way in and out of the American Civil War while also not shortchanging the battle between the states, and really giving one of the most detailed and nuanced cinematic versions of the conflict that really manages to give a perfect representation of the actual history of the war, the feeling of both sides of the conflict, and also replicating a lot of what was found in Matthew Brady's iconic photographs of the war. So it's also one of, if not the great American Civil War film. It is one of the great films for so many reasons, but it is one of the great films that became and truly is iconic. So it has that distinction as well. It is for that reason the perfect conclusion to the Dollars trilogy, because after the artistic heights of the first two films, you certainly had to go bigger and grander for a third and final film. After this point, the only way to progress after such an epic work that distills and can be seen to symbolize the entirety of the Western genre and summarize everything Leone had done in his films up to that point, the only way forward was to do something entirely different that was still developing the same core themes Leone was fascinated with, but in an entirely different way. And that is why you have the absolute sea change in terms of experience with Once Upon a Time in the West, which is obviously the same director and personnel of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, but the two films are entirely different in approach. So it took that sort of left turn into taking the favorite themes and depiction of the American West and the actual historical events and naturally evolving into something that was new. So that is why there's the distinction between the two films, and why The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is really the transitional point between the Leone style of For a Few Dollars More and what you see on Once Upon a Time in the West, which makes The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly an even more important film because it shows one foot in either side, as it is a transitional work. So now to talk about this Arrow 4K restoration and new physical media release on both UHD and Blu-ray formats. This is coming from the same Retrivada 4K negative scan that was done years ago and was first released by MGM on Blu-ray with the notoriously horrendous color grade applied to it. This was then handled by Kino in two different forms. First, their 2017 Blu-ray that tried to address the color quite badly and resulted in a worse-looking image, but with other tweaks and things applied to it, so it was better and much worse at the same time, and that didn't really please or help anyone. Then their UHD revisit was an attempt to correct past mistakes, and so they worked on the Retrivada master and were able to, with the assistance of some of the fan historians, get the international version of the film reconstructed, and that was a first for home video, as previous releases of the international version were slightly tweaked in their edit or missing shots. But also address the color timing to get it as good as they possibly could in terms of dialing out the revisionist color grade. They did use dye transfer Technicolor prints and other reference materials, but unfortunately they couldn't eliminate 100% of the Retrivada colors. So you saw some of the teal blues and other odd colors poking their ugly heads in here and there, most especially in all of the Union Blue uniforms, which were no longer Union Blue. So it was as good as it could be visually, but it was still working from defective files that they were given and trying to undo errors and issues. They also used the fan historian provided capture of the Laserdisc mono track from the initial widescreen release, which I have here, which is the best known quality version of the English mono track to exist. So they took that track that the fans had synchronized, and that's what was on that UHD, which was otherwise SDR only because this was an older 4K master and had never been mastered in HDR. So that Kino version was as good as it got, even though it didn't have a version of the long Italian version or any longer edit of the film, because they opted to only include one version and thankfully decided to go with the superior edited international cut, which had never been fully represented on video before. Now, at the time, I and many other Leone fans said, well, this is really as good as it gets until somebody else comes in or the rights holders decide to put a lot of time and money and effort into a complete overhaul and restoration process. If they're going to be using the same 4K scan, basically putting all of this effort in that they should have done the first time around to actually get it as good as humanly possible, fix all of the color issues, restore the mono audio track and have it in full fidelity, and maybe produce new extras, but get it as good as humanly possible, short of doing a brand new 4K scan and starting over entirely from scratch, which is very cost prohibitive and may not be much more advanced over the raw 4K scan you already have. Well, the Arrow release is finally going in and making a version that is as good as humanly possible from this same Retrovato 4K scan. So Arrow's restoration process was essentially to go to the raw 4K scan itself before anything was done and do the color grading themselves as extraordinarily carefully as humanly possible with as many dye transfer reference prints and other reference materials as they could get to provide the most consistent and balanced and accurate color presentation the film has ever seen outside of the original release. This also meant cooperating with the two sets of rights holders to get access to any materials that were possible to find or access or that still survived, and work with the fan historian and preservation community to access their research and materials. And I was myself involved in this to a small, tiny degree, so I count myself as among that group somewhere in, the guy standing in the back. So this included gathering audio sources and doing a new transfer of the original soundtrack negative and other sound vault elements, but also getting the soundtracks from past video releases, looking at the MGM Laserdisc direct capture again in terms of the PCM audio track of that superior audio source, also doing new work to get a proper 100% perfect audio sync of that source, which I'll discuss when I get to the audio, is very important, but also looking at the lost and deleted materials that no longer survive, tried to work and reconstruct those, and also make alternative versions of the film that actually reincorporated some of those materials. The disc release and overall project was actually delayed quite significantly in order to try and get this as right and as perfect as humanly possible. So this was a lot of work that was done behind the scenes. This wasn't merely we're just restoring a film. This was throwing out a gigantic net of trying to get as many materials and do as much research and collaborate with as many experts and fans as possible to essentially make this as good as humanly possible. That is the phrase you have to apply here, because this is one of the few times where you can truly say that about a restoration project or a physical media release. There was no stone left unturned in this process. There was a lot of trial and error. There was a lot of research. There was a lot of manpower and a lot of contributions from other individuals that went into this release. So this is not merely a physical media upgrade, nor is it merely a film restoration, and it certainly is not something to overlook since it is using the same scan as before. As Arrow has even done their own HDR presentation, so they have very carefully done HDR grading for both Dolby Vision and HDR10, in addition to also mastering the film in SDR, so that means properly mastering the entire film 3 times. Arrow's process has easily surpassed every past restoration attempt that the studios and past rights holders have done on this film, and have also had to deal with trying to correct almost 60 years of issues. So to talk about the picture quality of this release, the film has 2 discs of feature cuts of the film. Disc 1 is, of course, the international cut, and Disc 2 has the extended cut with various branching options. The feature discs were encoded beautifully by Fidelity and Motion, with the international cut disc obviously having a higher bitrate because it's the shorter version of the film and doesn't have all of the branched cuts and other things sharing the disc. However, the bitrate of the extended cut disc is not that much less and does not show any issues whatsoever, and is a real marvel of disc encoding because it has at least 4 different presentations of a long epic film plus commentaries and other supplements, and doesn't have any issues in the picture quality with a disc that is that unbelievably stuffed with materials. The entirety of the film was restored, so regardless of whichever disc you're watching in terms of the international cut or one of the extended cut presentations, it's still the same overall appearance because it's the master before it was then conformed into the actual cuts. So in terms of picture quality, in short, this is the best the film has ever looked on physical media, ever. And it also completely wipes the floor with the past versions of the Retrovada scan found on the MGM and Kino Lorber releases. This has absolutely no color issues whatsoever. This is the one time I've seen a video version of the film that wasn't in the analog era or early digital era. Basically, this is the first version of the film since the 1998 master to not have some color quirk to its timing or some visual issue, as since 1998 the film has been hit with various degrees of edge enhancement and DNR and had color problems on the MGM masters of their extended version. Then when we started getting the Retrovada scan, that had the horrible color and other issues, and then we got the Kino versions which had the terrible first version, and then the UHD did as good as it could, but it still had the Retrovada ugly color poking in, and all of that is now gone. This is the most natural appearance that I think we've ever had for the film. They've been so careful to try and get every shot just right in terms of the color timing, attempting to properly match all the reference materials and find that delicate balance without having any sign of the Retrovada color. And the dead giveaway on the Kino UHD, as good as it was that all of the Union Blue uniforms in terms of the Civil War sequences were not fully blue, and now they're fully blue. So that's just an example right there you can look for. But if you noticed, and you obviously would, you'd notice any of the Retrovada color in the terrible MGM Blu-ray or the 2 Kino releases, you know, it's there. It was a gigantic problem. And now to have this highest resolution scan we've ever had for the film not only have 0 sign of the Retrovada color, but have the most natural appearance because it's going back to the raw scan itself and having brand new restoration work done by a dedicated team and putting in this intensive amount of scrutiny to try and get it as right as possible. It's what we should have gotten the first time, and it's like a dream come true. So in terms of physical media releases, the Arrow restoration in terms of its visuals have the sort of hands-off feeling of the pre-1998 and analog transfer era releases, because those were mostly hands-off, especially the earlier ones that were direct print transfers, but also without the issues of the analog era and things not being always spot on in terms of accuracy, obviously. But it also doesn't have the issues of the modern transfer in terms of how the Retrovada scan's been handled before. So the Arrow restoration and presentation visually has all of the pluses of the Retrovada scan without any of the problems it's been saddled with for all these years. And it also has some of the as hands-off as you can get flavor of the earliest analog video releases in terms of the older masters that were direct print transfers. Those were, of course, not entirely accurate because it's, you know, an old master from the 80s or the 90s, depending on which release you're looking at. But you know, the letterbox Laserdisc has been my go-to version for years because it was the most hands-off you could get, and it had the best sounding original English mono, and now you can also have a tinge of that feeling in the Arrow version because it's been restored to the best of everyone's abilities, eliminating all the problems of the Richravada scan and making it as accurate as humanly possible in terms of the visual fidelity. And so for me, seeing this with this fantastic color timing throughout, it's really the first time I've seen the film on video and not had to point out any moment visually that had a color problem or a visual issue. And that goes for all of the home video transfers, even going back to the early 80s and the birth of home video. The HDR presentation has both HDR10 and Dolby Vision versions, as Arrow always has proper gradings for SDR, HDR10, and Dolby Vision for all the restoration work that they do. The HDR throughout the entirety of the film is the same unbelievable high quality standard and tasteful application as we see in the other two Arrow restorations of the Dollars trilogy. It is exquisite throughout. There is never an issue with the HDR in terms of moments being too bright or elements being pushed too far. It looks fantastic throughout, whether you have HDR10 or Dolby Vision capability, but as always, the Dolby Vision version is the superior option. It is more nuanced, it is more detailed, but the HDR10 is so expertly done that it's one of those examples where you don't lose too terribly much comparing the two HDR presentations if you can't do Dolby Vision at home. But it is a remarkable HDR presentation, and the type of HDR presentation that if you're going to have HDR, all catalog films need to be handled this way, because unfortunately, most catalog films are not really well done in terms of the HDR application, leading to frequent examples of things being too bright or pushed in areas that they were not originally visually designed to do. So when you get a beautiful restoration, you don't always get a beautiful HDR presentation to go along with that. And these Arrow restorations are a great example for how it should be done, because it is exquisitely done throughout, and there is not one issue in terms of the HDR presentation, but also we do have the film also preserved in SDR. So regardless of which format you can view at home, or if you have the SDR Blu-ray version of this set, you will have the best presentation experience possible. Now, that is not to say that the transfer is entirely blemish or issue free. This is still the same base 4K scan done by Richravada, and while Arrow has done additional restoration work, they are not able to, obviously completely eradicate everything that's part of the film negative and the source raw scan. So while some damage and issues have been worked on and addressed and are better represented in terms of how they are dialed out or cleaned up in this Arrow presentation as compared to the past releases by MGM and Kino Lorber, you still need to expect there is some light general wear here and there throughout the entirety of the film, regardless of which version you're watching. This is all minor stuff and very much similar to what appears in the other two films very slightly. So there are some bits of some speckling and light marks here and there in certain shots and scenes. There are some moments of fleeting light damage creeping in, so you'll see an occasional tiny scratch starting to poke in. There's also a little bit of movement here and there in terms of the image, but it's all extraordinarily minor. And then there's some original artifacts, such as a couple visible hairs here and there. Overall, it's about what you'd expect for a film that's had a history like this and was an Italian film produced in the 1960s, and this was all stuff that was visible in the past versions of this master. But it has been better addressed here than it has before, but it is something inherent to the visual experience. So essentially, expect a little bit of speckling, a little bit of movement, some tiny little bits of fluctuation here and there. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that is extraordinarily major, but, is comparable to what we saw in the other two restorations of the Dollars trilogy. Now, I did notice there are two moments in particular of very slight artifacting, and unfortunately, I think these are just baked into the scan itself. One is in the very start of the iconic main title sequence, the first red card with text credit on it. When the text comes up, there's a sort of almost, it's hard to describe, but it's a sort of little splotch effect where it's sort of a clear, almost sort of, it almost looks like somebody's dropped liquid onto the screen and it's sort of spread out with a little sort of aliasing effect. That was kind of on the past releases that I had noticed in that particular spot. So I think it's just something that's part of this scan. The other is unfortunately a small moment where there is a little bit of stagnation of the film grain, so a little bit of the sort of dreaded frozen grain effect. It's really only in this one shot, and it is minor, but I did notice it, and it does seem like it's baked into the scan itself, which is like what we saw in A Fistful of Dollars in the Arrow restoration, where there are two very tiny single shot fleeting moments of some slight grain stagnation that was part of the original scan, and that means there's nothing they can do about it. So it's extraordinarily minor here on GBU. It's just the one shot that I noticed it, but it's just that little tiny presence that is just another signifier that they're still having to use the Retrovada scan. So it's one of those things like some of the inherent damage you can't escape. It's part of the best source that exists. But thankfully, it's just that one single shot that's fleeting for a second, and it's more minor, so most people will probably never notice it. Now we turn to the audio quality, and the film features both the original mono mix and 5.1 remix versions on both the international and extended cut discs. Now, Arrow did get a new transfer of the original soundtrack negative source and other vault sources for the sound mix, but unfortunately all of them had various degrees of damage and degradation that meant that they weren't necessarily the best sounding. And so after a lot of trial and error and different restoration attempts, they started comparing it to the standard, which has been the 1990 Laserdisc I have here. No one knows what was used for the audio transfer on this release, but it's a lossless PCM copy of a superior audio element of some kind. That's why it's been used by fans, and myself included, as the basis for the ways we watch the film for really decades now, and it's why it was used on the Kino UHD release, as it was the best known version of the English mono to exist, and that disc merely used the fan-synced version of the capture of the audio of this disc, and that's what you get on that release, also upmixed to 5.1. So essentially, in their restoration process, Arrow ultimately decided that they would probably be best to stick with the 1990 Laserdisc audio source for their restoration, as they tried working on the negative transfer they had gotten of the original sound mix, and it was not in as high of quality and had more degradation and damage than the Laserdisc audio had. So they could either spend a lot of time and money they didn't have trying to get that transfer to sound at least as good as the Laserdisc audio, and it really wasn't going to be able to due to the damage and degradation. So it was really a sort of trade-off, and so that's why they opted for going with the Laserdisc to use as the primary source. So on this release, the audio, in terms of the mono mix and the restoration, you're actually getting a properly synced and cleaned up version of this 1990 track. And on top of that, the sync has been bettered and really perfected, as the previous fan sync and capture that was used on the Kino release did have some very tiny points where they had to do some sync edits. And if you were really, really paying close attention, you could actually hear those audible little sync points, which was merely due to having to try and maintain sync, and Kino was merely using the fan sync that had been done as good as possible. So Arrow has basically gone in and done the same thing, but perfected it, so there's no sync edit points, and it's been cleaned up some as compared to just having the raw track from the 1990 disc itself. I do still really enjoy the 1990 audio presentation having the raw version on Laserdisc, and if you were to compare this directly to the Arrow version is obviously properly restored to the true international cut, as this disc is not 100% the international cut either, as every video release of the film before the Arrow version is that it had some quirk or issue. But Arrow has also used this track to then conform it to the extended version of the film, and then also folded in the 2003 extended portions with the remix re-recorded dialogue into the 1990 Laserdisc mono transfer to properly restore the mono as best you can for the longer versions of the film. So this Laserdisc audio is basically used as the audio backbone and the primary audio source for this new restoration. So it's nice to still have this particular original disc for the raw audio, just to have it on hand, but it's essentially been replicated on the Arrow version, and this is basically the source for the audio presentation across the entirety of the set. So the mono restoration based on the Laserdisc audio source is rendered in lossless quality on both disc presentations. And as I mentioned, for the extended version, Arrow had to go back to the notoriously bad MGM 2003 5.1 remix, but have actually taken the time to not only produce a new mono version of the extended exclusive scenes, but also gone to lengths to not have the horrible replaced sound effects and modern gunshots and things. So they've basically made a new mono mix for the extended versions. It's basically a hybrid of the 1990 Laserdisc source, the transfers of the soundtrack negative, and the 2003 remix. So that way it's got all of the scenes in the film in an English dub, but without the horrible replaced sound effects and in the original mono form. So it's really what they should have done originally in 2003, and unfortunately, due to people making stupid choices and insisting on 5.1 with brand new sound effects and other horrible revisionist ideas, unfortunately, that didn't happen back in 2003. So Arrow has basically made a supreme purist mono mix to have the entirety of the film in English, but also completely in mono with the original sound effects. So there are no horrible revisionist issues, except for if the new English voices in the dub have always bothered you, well, they're still going to bother you, and they still stick out like a sore thumb. Now, the plan was to originally also include the full Italian version of the film and the Italian mono, with also the original Italian intermission. Unfortunately, after Fistful was done, the Italian rights holders decided they didn't want Arrow to have the Italian presentation, so that meant they couldn't include the Italian mono tracks they had already worked on cleaning up. So in some of the extras, you'll see some little bits of the Italian version with the Italian mono, but unfortunately Arrow couldn't include that here. So that's the one omission on this release, but that's not by their doing. It's simply just something they were forced to do. So unfortunately the Italian mono isn't included here, but we still have the intermission in the extras, and we have the new restoration of the original English dub. But then we turn and look at the 5.1 options, and just like the other two films, this 5.1 track is a very careful, painstaking upmix of the new mono restoration into a 5.1 configuration. It is kept front-oriented, there's little to no surround activity, and essentially it is all focused around the center channel to keep that mono focused, just like the original mix, with only the bigger moments and score cues sort of spreading out into the left and right channels a bit, and having some low frequency enhancement out of the LFE channel. So it retains the original sound field that is supposed to be screen oriented, obviously because it was a mono mix, and so you don't have any destruction of Leone's very carefully designed sound mixes. And this is what you need to do. If you insist on having a mono track that has to be brought into multi-channel, it has to be painstakingly transferred into multi-channel like this without losing any of the original intent. So the film obviously had the infamous 2003 5.1 remix that tried to modernize everything and is one of the worst remixes of all time. Thankfully, this is the complete opposite of that. This is a perfectly respectable and commendable effort by Arrow. So, like the other two films, it is a 5.1 mix that preserves the original experience and uses the new mono restoration. However, the trade-off is you lose some of the clarity and focus compared to the original mono. It is a bit more modernized, And frankly, it's nowhere near as effective as the original mono track. So I'd always encourage people to not bother with the remix unless you absolutely have to have a remix just because you insist a 1966 Italian Western that was post-synchronized into other languages has to be 5.1 or greater for reasons, I guess. But in the event that you do insist on a remix, this is finally a true, proper transitioning of the original mono mix into 5.1 that isn't just a very quick rushed version as what we saw in the Kino UHD, where it was basically like the mono Laserdisc sync had been just run through an up mixer. Is very basic and simple. This one by Arrow's team is very, very carefully done and is properly ensuring that none of the original sonic intent is changed or lost, as that's something that very frequently happens even in 5.1 remixes that don't actually change the effects. So if you compare this to, say, the abominable Paramount 5.1 remix of Once Upon a Time in the West, that remix doesn't change anything, but it actually changes the dynamics of the mixing for every single scene, and the music overpowers elements, and the spatial dynamics are completely different than the original mono. So that's a great comparison to make with this Arrow 5.1 remix that preserves the sonic intent and keeps everything front-locked and oriented and never lets the music overpower anything, even though it's now being transitioned into multi-channel. But ultimately, I would encourage people to only view this film with the mono restoration, and if you want to play around and make comparisons, you can do so, and I think you'll be quite surprised that the 5.1, as impressive as it is, and as respectful and as accurate as it is actually inferior to the original single-channel mono mix, because it's having to transform and transition something into a different container that it wasn't originally designed for. So again, the mono presentation is the definitive way to experience the film, but we at least finally have a proper, archivally minded, respectful 5.1 remix of this film to completely bury the abominable 2003 MGM remix for all time. So now to talk about the packaging and artwork of the Arrow limited edition release on UHD and Blu-ray. This is done in the same hard case with slipcover style, with beautiful new Tony Stella artwork that matches the other two, featuring Blondie, this time rendered in red, black, and white. So it's a beautiful continuation of the other two sets. And of course, it has the matching spine that on the shelf forms a matching image on all three. So when you have all three on the shelf, you have an image of the sun burning down with a character from each film. So we have the Man with No Name, Colonel Mortimer, and Tuco, all representing each of the films, but forming a beautiful, unique image that you only get by having all three on the shelf next to one another. So this kind of makes up for the fact that these were not in a single box set, but on the shelf you can form this incredible box set image of your own. So on the rear we have the same design and layout as the other two, with more wraparound imagery poking in, but also the substantial amount of supplements plus the great text write-up of the film, and then all of the copyright and technical information. And nicely, they've once again retained the Leone-looking font to match the iconic fonts of the promotional materials. Remove the slipcover to find the hard box itself with the same artwork, but now with a lovely sort of flatter finish that actually looks quite nice. And even though it might be slightly more subdued compared to the printing on the slipcover, there's something to be said about how these look really nice and give the appearance of what you might expect on a nice hardcover book. And here we get the lovely wraparound artwork with more beautiful Tony Stella imagery, just like the other two hard boxes. So you do get that wraparound effect. Inside, we have the case with another alternative, beautiful matching Tony Stella piece of art. So this matches the case artwork and secondary posters for the other two Dollars Trilogy Arrow releases. And again, We have a lovely retaining of the Italian title as well. The spine also matches the other two, and so does the rear, which also gives us the list of supplements again. The actual case itself, in terms of the secondary art, is essentially what you're getting on the standard release version. So this should look pretty familiar if you didn't catch the limited edition in terms of what you've actually got on the standard release version. It's basically this as the primary artwork. Inside, we have Disc 1, the UHD of the international cut and extras, and then Disc 2 is the UHD with the extended cuts and extras. Disc 3 is a Blu-ray of all of the other extras, so this is the bulk of all of the new and legacy supplements, but it is also region B locked, so this is why you will need region free capability to fully enjoy this release, because while the UHDs are region free, the Blu-ray extras disc is unfortunately still region B locked. And if you've got the Blu-ray version of this set, all of the Blu-ray discs are region locked as well. And then the exclusive disc to the limited edition is disc 4, which is the Blu-ray of the documentary Sad Hill Unearthed. And this is about the restoration by fans of the iconic Sad Hill Cemetery set and the whole process it was, the massive undertaking. And of course, it is still an ongoing project, and you can now actually visit the site today and see their amazing work firsthand. But this is a fantastic documentary, and it's really amazing that Arrow is able to get it included in this set, but it is unfortunately the exclusive disc here, so the standard release version will only have the first 3 discs and not include the documentary disc. It should also be said that the disc labels are beautifully chosen, because the documentary disc uses the poster image that was made for that documentary, but then the actual feature discs and the supplements disc, because of course it's discs 1, 2, and 3, well, for this film, of course, you're going to focus on the 3 characters. So we have Blondie on disc 1, but of course we also have Angel Eyes and Tuco on disc 2 and disc 3. So even the attention to detail is found on the disc labels, which is just, I know it's a small thing, but it's really not a small thing. It's a really fantastic touch that shows that, again, there was no stone left unturned on this release. And we also have reversible art featuring the iconic 1967 US one-sheet artwork, beautifully reproduced with the arrow identifiers on the bottom. Even the title font of the poster is replicated on the spine. The rear has the same information, but slightly updated to match the font and colors of the original one-sheet. Inside, we also have the limited edition book, which is matching to the others and runs about 60 pages, replicating the beautiful new artwork, and of course the title font on the spine. This has 4 fantastic essays done in the same wonderful style with beautiful imagery throughout, tons of original stills and production images, and nicely readable text, so the text is perfectly sized. But what sets it apart from the other 2 is that it has an About the Versions piece at the end by James Flower, and he goes into detail about the release history of the film and how they were not able to get all of the rights to have the full Italian version with Italian mono, but also gets into some of the restoration headaches and the fact that there are still variations being found with this film, still unknown things about the release history of this film and how the negative got into the state that it is, and what happened to certain scenes that were deleted and the various cuts and trim versions that were made over the years, the production of the 161-minute international cut that was released in 1967, what Leone's input in all of these were, and also giving you insight into just how difficult all of this is, and that it's practically impossible to have a 100% completely authentic iteration of the film, because not everything exists and things are simply still in a state of not everything is known about the film. There are still some outstanding mysteries. There are still some elements that unfortunately only survive in compromised versions, and entire sequences that are still lost, such as the famous Socorro sequence, but also having to discuss how they didn't have the full authority with the rights holders to do all of the work that would be necessary to completely restore all aspects of this film, or to have the full Italian version with the Italian mono audio. So this is the most important piece here, because it gets into more of the minutia of why the film is the way it is, and also explaining all the presentation choices and how everything possible was retained, even having the optical flip transition restored to all cuts of this film that was used during the opening sequence of Tuco escaping the hangman's noose time and time again. It's a comical transition that was actually left out of the MGM version. So this is also getting into details of what Arrow had to do, but also why they did things the way that they did, and how the actual status of the film is in terms of the surviving elements. So this goes a long way beyond just the usual wonderful about the presentation notes, because this will give you the technical cliff notes of the work that they did and the credits for everyone involved in terms of the actual disc presentation. But so much work went into this release that this just gives you a basic idea. I mean, they could write an entire book about the work that they had to do on just GBU, just like the other two films, but GBU even more because of all the variations, and it's a longer film, and all the weird things that have happened to this film over the years and the iterations it's existed in. So at least you get information here, and you get a further essay piece describing more of the wild ride that is the history of the presentation of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But again, it's really just a explanatory taster, because you could easily have a 200-page book just about the versions and history of this film. Then the rear has the title with credits, and nicely reuses once again vintage promotional dialogue from some of the release posters. The limited edition physical materials conclude with a poster reproducing the beautiful new Tony Stella artwork that's used on the interior case and the standard edition. And then, like the other two, we have a reproduction of the original US 1 sheet, which is very nicely done. So these are nicely displayable, even though they're obviously folded and not rolled. But it's to always be commended if you're going to do a poster reproduction, whether it's new or vintage artwork, it needs to be to a quality standard like this, where everything is done to a good level of detail. Now, I will say, when you're handling the limited edition box set materials, the actual smell factor that I talk about with these Arrow box sets, in terms of how they've been doing their limited edition sets for the past couple years, whatever the materials are that they use, I think it's a combination of the ink and the paper stock and the booklets in particular, but at times it can have a particular sort of odor. It's probably not going to bother most people, but if you're like me and you read a lot of vintage books and you get used to different smells and you kind of have a more sensitive nose, you'll notice that can be a factor in these sets. For these Dollars Trilogy sets, it is a minor thing, but I will say that here on GBU, it's extraordinarily minor. In fact, I think of the three, it has it the least. So if you've noticed that, or that's something that kind of bothers you, it's thankfully not a major factor in these sets, and the worst offender still remains the Barbarella limited set that Arrow did a few years ago. That was where I first really noticed this factor, because as soon as I got the plastic off, it pretty much knocked me down. So thankfully that none have ever been that level, but these sets just have that as a tiny little factor in terms of when you're actually reading through the book or looking at the poster and handling the box set materials, that you'll just smell that tiny little odor a little bit. Now to talk about the discs themselves and the exhaustive amount of supplemental features. So I'll go through one disc at a time, because the extras are nicely spaced out across the 4 discs in the limited edition. Again, do keep in mind the standard edition has the first 3 discs of this set, but unfortunately does not include the 4th documentary disc, which is exclusive to the limited sets. Disc 1 is devoted to the international cut of the film, which is is really the definitive version of the film myself and most fans argue for. This, of course, runs about 161 to 162 minutes and is the version that has been in circulation in various forms throughout most of the world for most of the film's release history, or at least before the 2003 extended MGM version took precedence in a lot of countries and the US. As I mentioned in the transfer discussion section, this is the same restoration transfer as what you find on the extended cut disc. So whichever version of the film you watch, you're getting the new restoration master, but here on disc 1, you're getting it 100% conformed to the international cut, referencing original print elements to get everything exactly 100% correct, making both this and the previous Kino UHD the only times the international cut has been 100% replicated on any release, as even the older versions and the Laserdisc and VHS era had issues with the edits or missing shots and frames. The menu is in the nice standard simplistic Arrow style, with a great selection of clips from the film showing the 3 characters running in the background, and here on disc 1 we have the iconic main title running on a loop throughout, which makes you excited to revisit the epic film. Also, as I said before, because this is the shorter version of the film with less extras on the disc, this is technically the highest bit rate of the presentations on the set, so there's that factor as well, but otherwise it is the international cut with the monomix restoration and the new 5.1 Purist version of the original monomix. Like the other trilogy releases, disc 1 has a small amount of features tucked in. This is basically the commentary track and then the trailer and advertising gallery. So here we have ported over the outstanding Tim Lucas commentary track that he did for the Kino Lorber release, as he did commentaries for each of their releases of the trilogy. This is another of his essential commentaries. I think it's one of the best commentaries ever recorded. It is a joy to re-listen to, and along with Sir Christopher Frehling's track, essential listening as one of the great commentaries of all time. It is a wealth of information and insight that forms a perfect companion piece to Frehling's pre-existing commentary that was done for the MGM versions. And this is the one commentary track that is specifically done for the international cut, which is why it's here. The other commentaries are done for the MGM extended edit, and so that's why those are on disc 2. The Lucas commentary was one of the standout features of the Kino releases and is an absolute must-listen if you haven't heard it, and that's why I am so ecstatic that Arrow was able to retain it here along with all of the other legacy extras the film has ever had. It's also rewarding to re-listen to because it does take a little tiniest of swipes at the unbelievably boring and dull and not very insightful Richard Schickel commentary, which I'll get to when I talk about disc 2. But I have a lot of baggage with that track because I think I may have listened to it at least 15 or 20 times over the years, and I do not recommend that because it is a horrible commentary. So everything else in terms of the supplements on disc 1 is the gallery of trailers and TV ads and radio spots. Now these are crucially important because some of them do actually have the only surviving footage from some of the film's most famous deleted missing sequences. So here the first trailer is actually in 4K resolution with Dolby Vision HDR, and that's a 4K scan of the original German trailer of the film. This starts with full explanatory notes and images by the great Mike Siegel. He explains the importance of this trailer and specifically highlights that it includes moments from the Lost Socorro sequence and of the Battle of the Cannons before we get into the Ecstasy of Gold sequence. These sequences only survive in some stills and then these tiny little scraps of footage that are only in certain foreign trailers like this German trailer. So this was a trailer that he had in his collection, and he sold it to fellow Leone superfans and fan historians and preservationists, Jordan Krug and Benji Haran, who were the ones who did the massive amount of work and research into getting original prints and researching the release history, and were the primary consultants among the fan historian community for the Arrow releases. So they did a 4K scan of this trailer, and that's what's presented here. So we not only get a beautiful explanatory presentation with images of why these trailers are so important, but then we get a full 4K scan with Dolby Vision HDR of this trailer. Now, there is obviously some wear, but it's held up extraordinarily well, and we get to see in full restored glory those two specific moments of Eli Wallach's Tuco in the famous deleted sequences. So this is all we have surviving of those moments, and the only thing we have that is surviving that isn't just a still, of course, is dubbed in German, but still, just to have that in this level of quality is fantastic. Also, the German dialogue has subtitles, and it's the specific subtitles for the German dialogue itself. So Arrow actually took the time to make sure that the actual German dialogue had the proper English subtitles. The only issue here, as good as this is and amazing an artifact to have properly preserved, is that I guess perhaps due to whoever did the scan work or however the file was generated, there is unfortunately a good degree of frozen grain going on. So when you see characters' heads move, you see that sort of sticky moving with them sort of effect. Of course, it's minimized because it's a trailer that obviously was from the 1960s and had wear and was not the original element and such. But if you notice things like frozen grain, you'll note that it's unfortunately here in what is otherwise just a beautifully presented 4K scan of an original trailer with priceless material in it. But fret not, because we also have a 4K Dolby Vision HDR presentation of the original French trailer. This is the same exact edit, just with French dialogue and text, so we have the all-important pieces of the deleted material that no longer survives. But here, while the actual appearance is a bit dimmer because it's not as bold in its color timing, I actually think this has a more natural looking appearance, and this doesn't have any frozen grain artifacts. So we have both of the surviving trailers with the exclusive material that shows how the film was sold in Germany and France, both scanned at 4K resolution and presented with Dolby Vision HDR, so they're as good as possible, with two different color timing and visual appearances. But I actually think the French trailer looks better because it doesn't have the frozen grain issue. So if you notice that on the German trailer, you then get to look at the French trailer in the same resolution with Dolby Vision HDR, not have that frozen grain issue, and have a different appearance that looks a little bit more naturalized. And again, here the audio is the French dub, once again with properly translated English-specific captions for the actual French dialogue that's being spoken. We then have the original United Artists USA trailer from the 1967 release. That is properly preserved here. This is a 1080p HD presentation in scope. The overall trailer quality is quite high with obviously some wear, but it looks fantastic, and it does seem to be similar to what's been on past releases, but they've never been as well encoded or presented as this version. And it should be noted that all of the trailers on this disc do not have any of the encoding and frame rate problems that they did on all the Kino releases. We then have the UK trailer in 1080p HD. This does show more wear, and it is basically the same edit and style as the US trailer. It's got the same United Artists voiceover and ad copy. It's just the edits are slightly different to accommodate fancier on-screen titles and graphics and a fancier title card. And it's basically just slightly specialized for the UK market. There is a little bit of digital noise in this. The overall transfer and the element itself is not in as good as quality as the US trailer, but still it's fantastic to have any of these trailer variants because unfortunately the promotional campaigns for the Dollars trilogy have not been all that well preserved, and most of the trailers only exist as heavily worn old standard definition transfer files. We then have 3 of the original US TV spots for the film. Together they run about 2 minutes and 21 seconds, and they are of course 4:3, but they were given an HD scan, and in spite of having some color fading, are wonderful artifacts of how you would have seen the film advertised in these tiny little chunks on television, basically being very hyped up versions of what was in the original trailer and radio spot ad campaign. And on top of that, you get to see the early version of panning and scanning of the film because it's in a 4:3 frame, and so everything looks really blocked off, but it's actually not bad. It's of course these little 30-second or less spots for the most part, but you do get one really hysterically funny bad early pan and scan attempt. But they try to show the wide establishing shot of the duel in Sad Hill Cemetery, and the way the image just quickly It like does a lightning fast pan across the whole image. It just goes whoosh as it comes up. So if you love studying how films were pan and scanned on video, that's a really fun artifact of the time, because you see how they would just throw up images on these television spots and not always worry about how it looked if you actually studied it closely. Because, of course, they just pop up on TV for like 30 seconds to get people hyped about going to see the movie. So it's another fascinating artifact of the film's ad campaign, and amazing we have it here in HD quality. And then the gallery closes out with a single surviving United Artists radio spot, which is another of their fantastically hyped up audio-only versions of the original trailer, but condensed down into a short runtime. United Artists were masters of selling films and hyping films up, but in particular, I think their greatest genius at times was actually in the radio spots, because they would take already fantastic trailers and ad campaigns and condense them down into these hyper epic audio-only bits. So this is a 36-second original radio spot that hypes up the ad copy of the original trailer beautifully. It's here in Lossy Dolby Digital, but at least we have one of the radio spots surviving. Although it would be nice someday if it was known that there were perhaps other radio spots and maybe some of them survive, because I'd love to hear them, because I adore vintage radio spots. I think it's one of the great lost arts of selling films. Now to move on to Disc 2 and the extended cut presentations. Now, Arrow was not allowed to include the Italian release version or the Italian mono track, which is unfortunate because it seems like they did all the restoration work for it, as we can glimpse through the various clips and some of the extras that show and have the Italian version with the Italian audio track. However, on the extended cut presentations, you do essentially have the full-length Italian version of the film. It's not exactly the same, but you do have all the materials that were found in the extended English language version of the film that MGM prepared in 2003. So if you're used to seeing that and you prefer the longer version of the film, you will be satisfied with the presentations on Disc 2. However, this is the most comprehensive presentation of a long version of the film that we've ever gotten, plus it gives the viewer multiple options, plus an additional truly amazing secret version as well that's hidden as an Easter egg. So Disc 2 is not merely, oh, it's the long version of the film. It's also not the MGM 2003 version, nor is it the Italian release version. It's basically a disc that gives you everything in the kitchen sink in terms of options and what is actually included in different versions of the film, whichever you choose to go with. And for the first time ever, you have a properly restored original mono presentation of the English dub, so you hear the film as intended in the long version with the English dub. There is none of the horrendous 5.1 remix tomfoolery that MGM did back in 2003, which is still one of, if not possibly, the worst audio remix of all time. Instead, what Arrow has done is basically do what MGM should have done in the first place back then, had they not been forced to have all kinds of new sound effects and make a fully modernized 5.1 mix by those financing the project. But Arrow has essentially gone in and made what you could call a hybrid mono restoration track for the longer versions of the film. This is taking their new restored version of the English mono and then supplementing it with a mono version of the specific sections that were unique to the Italian versions that were dubbed into English in 2003. So for those sections, Arrow has had to rely on the 2003 dubbing of the lead three actors, Eli Wallach, Clint Eastwood, and a vocal impersonator for Lee Van Cleef. And while those are obviously voices that stick out like a sore thumb due to just the difference in sound, what Arrow has done is taken those and mix them in with the elements of the original mix for those scenes, presumably using their transfers of the soundtrack negative and the Italian sources, and made a composite mono track for those scenes. So you have the 2003 voices, but all the original sound effects, and it's in mono, and it is painstakingly done, so you never have anything that's jarring in those scenes now, except for the 2003 voices. But those have been mixed in better, so they're not as glaringly in your face as they were back in 2003. And all of this takes quite a lot of time and care and attention to detail. Not many people would do that. Most labels would probably just fold down the 5.1 to mono in those sections and slot it in there and say, well, there you go. And of course, you'd still be stuck with the horrible modernized gunshots and all the other terrible sound effects they added. This has been done on certain releases where they just folded down the awful 5.1 remix to mono and tried to call it a mono track. And that's something MGM did on a lot of their Leone releases over the years on and off. They would sometimes just fold down their 5.1 remix and call it the original mono, which it sure as heck wasn't. So it has to be commended that Arrow went to this effort to essentially make a purist mono mix that would be English all the way through, and taking what they had from that craptastic 2003 5.1 remix, Abomination, and trying to actually make something out of it. Again, this is what should have been done back in 2003, is to take the best surviving elements of the original mono mix, properly restore it, and then for the unique Italian sections to make a purist and historically accurate as possible mono mix for those sections, obviously with the new voices dubbed in. So that's what you have here, and that's really important to note. So that makes this a proper listening experience, and one that actually suits a 1966 Italian film that was dubbed into English. It would have been perfect had they also been able to include the Italian mono, or at least for those sections, and had a English-Italian hybrid track like what was seen on Indicator's release of The Big Gun Down. Unfortunately, because of the rights issues and decisions made, they were not able to do that either, but I know had that not been an issue, that Arrow would have very likely included a mix of the Italian and English mono tracks, in addition to also including the Italian track had they been able to do so. The 5.1 track on this disc is a careful upmixing of this new mono track. It's the same 5.1 as found on the disc 1 of this set for the international cut, but with these extended sections essentially. Now they also have had to do a careful upmix of the mono that they made for those specific sections. So in this 5.1 presentation, you're getting those sections also carefully expanded. So obviously they did this 5.1 upmix from the full-length mono track that they had made for the extended version, and then likely conformed that to the international cut. So they basically did all the work for all the footage of the film and the long version. So basically, you're looking at a complete track that's running about 3 hours that has been also carefully upmixed to 5.1 to preserve the proper front-center orientation of the sound, to not move the sound around in any way, to have little to no surround usage, and only allow natural spreading out into the main left and right channels and LFE during the bigger sequences such as the battle at the bridge and in the louder music passages, but always maintaining the sonic intent of the original mix design. Now, about the versions and the options you're given on this disc as a viewer, you're essentially given 5 options of a long, roughly 3-hour film on this disc. There's something for everyone, and you will very likely finally be able to see a long version of the film in the form that you actually prefer or have always wanted. So first of all, you're given the choice to view the film with or without the infamous grotto scene. This is the scene where Tuco is in a sort of grotto and he comes in with a chicken, and this is how he recruits the gang members. And these are the gang members that we see come in through the hotel room door and get gunned down by Blondie when Tuco comes in through the window. In the international cut, we never see how they're recruited, and in fact, in the Italian release version, we didn't either, because this scene was only in the premiere cut of the film. So it's basically shown one time, and then Sergio Leone removed it himself as he felt it didn't quite work or slowed down the pacing, and it does. It does stand out. I mean, it's a fine enough scene, but it doesn't really belong in the film, and you can very easily see why it was removed after the premiere screening. MGM inserted this into the film in 2003, and it's been stuck there in their long version ever since. And if you're trying to properly recreate the long Italian release version of the film, this scene does not belong there. So this scene should only be in a reconstruction of the original premiere version of the film. And so finally, we now have an option on a disc where you are given the option to view the long version of the film with or without the grotto scene. So right there, you have 2 versions of the film seamlessly branched, and there's a little bit of text actually on the menu explaining what this option is, and it makes it very clear for anyone looking at the menu what option is what. And just to have that choice is fantastic, because I've always wanted a long version of the film properly restored on disc that gave you the option to not see the grotto scene, because it does stick out like a sore thumb for not just myself, but I know a lot of fans of the film also feel this way. So essentially, that's what this option is. However, there's another choice as well, because Arrow has decided to spoil us after being stuck with the screwy MGM version for all these years. We have an option on this disc to also view the film with or without the full-length restored torture sequence, because the torture of Tuco in the Civil War camp, the Union camp by Angel Eyes and Wallace, originally ran much longer, and the reason why MGM did not restore this was that the footage was deemed too damaged or too far gone, and it would stick out, and they couldn't really do much with it back in 2003. Well, Arrow has taken it upon themselves to actually restore this sequence. There is obviously some damage that's still inescapable, but they've done a miraculous job of reconstructing the full-length torture sequence, which also has a significant additional portion of the song being performed by the soldiers outside to cover up the horrendous beating that's taking place. And in fact, the edit of the sequence is different. It's much longer. The pacing of the scene is different, and the overall impact is different. So it's essential to study this and then compare it to how it was done in the release versions. But you're also given the opportunity to view this long version of the film with the uncut version of the torture sequence or with the release version. So you're even given that option. So that's technically two more versions of the film. So you can view it with or without the grotto scene, and you can view it with or without the uncut torture sequence. The fifth version is the Easter egg that's hidden on the disc. Once you go to a certain submenu and you were to press an arrow on your remote, you'll find an option for what I would term the warts and all presentation of the film. This is essentially Arrow giving fans a gift, because what they've done in this cut is actually put in the grotto scene, put in the uncut torture sequence, and then also include the surviving deleted materials that have been reconstructed as best as possible. So some of the deleted scene materials that are found in the deleted scenes gallery on this disc have been reinstated into the edit of this restoration master in this Easter egg warts and all version. So this version runs almost 3 hours and 2 minutes, basically 3 hours and 1 minute and change, and is the most complete version of the film in terms of everything that survives is in this iteration, essentially, because this also includes the extra deleted scene during the desert trek when Blondie falls down into the bottom of the sand dune, and there's the bit of bones everywhere, and he picks up a bone and Tuco shoots it out of his hand, and that has been reconstructed as best as possible, but unfortunately not all of the dialogue survives, but that has been reinstated into its proper place in the film in this sequence. This version is obviously not the release version, nor is it Leone's intended way for you to see the film, but it's an absolute treat for fans to see what is essentially the ultimate long version of the film, including some of the deleted materials and the uncut torture sequence and the grotto scene. However, this long, unofficial version of the film is probably the best argument fans can have for saying why the international cut is the superior version of the film, because this slightly extended version, even compared to the already extended longer version, exacerbates some of the pacing issues of the longer version, so it accentuates even more the inherent issues in the long version of the film, and once again points to why the international cut is more effective in almost all areas, because it's a tighter film, it's more focused, the pacing is far superior, and the story flow, the narrative flow works much better, even though you do lose some really fantastic sequences from the extended version. But most of the other stuff in the extended version, while it's great or it's more with our iconic stars, it just doesn't really do a whole lot, or it repeats things that have already been said in exposition or would be said later. So the materials of the longer version have always been debated by fans. Personally, I would say that of all of the materials in the long versions of the film, there are several scenes that are fantastic and you hate to lose them, but I would say with perhaps one exception of the scene of Blondie and Angel Eyes and the 6 is a perfect number sequence, essentially at the campsite when we get the reveal of the rest of Angel Eyes' gang. Outside of that scene, pretty much everything in the longer versions of the film isn't really necessary and does disrupt the flow and the pacing that is much better in the international cut of the film. But to be able to have the option to view the long version of the film and see it any way you wish, and on top of that be given the absolute treat of being able to see every bit of surviving material properly reincorporated into the film, including even the deleted scene reconstruction and the uncut torture sequence, and basically seeing everything is just absolutely miraculous and something I thought would never happen. And given their difficulties with not being able to include the Italian versions and Italian mono track, I'm amazed they were able to do this. Now, as I mentioned, the bitrate is a bit lower on disc 2 simply because you have the longer version of the film and you've got at least 5 different versions plus extras. And in spite of that, the bitrate isn't all too much lower than what's found on disc 1. The encoding of this disc, of course from Fidelity and Motion, is an absolute marvel because never once is the picture impacted by having essentially 5 versions of a long film in 4K resolution on the same disc, branched, plus extras and commentaries. Never once does that cause an issue. So this is a marvel of disc encoding, and my hat goes off once again to Fidelity and Motion because I simply don't know how they did it. This is an absolute marvel of disc encoding, and one you can actually study for what is good disc encoding on UHD when you've got a ton of material. You've essentially got 5 versions of a 3-hour film in 4K resolution, plus 2 commentaries, 2 audio tracks, and extras. It's just miraculous. So this is another Fidelity and Motion marvel of a disc encoding job. To move on to the supplements of this disc, we have the 2 commentary tracks done for MGM releases, and they have been synced up to this new version of the long version of the film, as they were originally done for the MGM 2003 extended version of the film. The first is the infamous Richard Schickel commentary from the MGM DVD. It has been on all the other versions ported over. This is one of the first commentary tracks I ever really listened to as a kid growing up in terms of actually paying attention. And it kind of turned me off commentary tracks for a long while because I'm not one to really complain about commentary tracks and reviews, but having to listen to Richard Schickel for 3 hours, essentially, just make some general observations and say and a lot, plus make a few errors and a few questionable statements and continually kind of act like the film is not necessarily all that special. Essentially, this is a prime example of why Richard Schickel commentaries are to be avoided and are often derided and complained about among those of us who love film commentary tracks. They're almost always quite bad, and if you want one that's even worse, try listening to him for 4 hours on Once Upon a Time in America, which, again, I do not recommend. So I'm glad this track has been ported over. I've now listened to this probably at least 15 times or more over the years, and I'm probably never going to listen to it again because you really get nothing out of this. It will be 3 hours that you won't get back. In fact, the only way I get through it is because I rip commentaries from discs and I listen to them just as a separate audio file that I make myself, because I actually prefer listening to commentary tracks that way and actually thinking about the film, and it essentially becomes like a film podcast that you make yourself, and you can listen in spurts or while you're driving or whatever you're doing. And even doing it that way, this track is an absolute chore, and again, I've heard this maybe 15 times now, and there's nothing really of merit, but at least it's here, it's been preserved. It is the only extra that I think most people can skip because it's a terrible commentary track. But for completion's sake, it's here, it's well presented, and for those who have actually been able to enjoy this track, you've got it here as well. But it is really the only one of the extras that is just completely skippable. Listening to it again really underlined how bad of an experience it is, because you're essentially just listening to somebody react to the film and have an occasional well, it's not really an insight, it's just an occasional tidbit about the production or something that Clint Eastwood told him once. That's about it. And then sort of coming away with the, oh yeah, it's pretty good after 3 hours of this. So yeah, I do not recommend this track, but I am so thankful it is here, and thus the legacy extras are all here on this release. The other track is, of course, the Sir Christopher Frayling track. It is I can't even say it's the superior of the two, because the Schickel track is such a throwaway that the Frayling track is the only track you should be bothering with. And the fact that MGM decided to only include the Schickel track on the 2004 DVD has always haunted me, because they had these two to choose from and they could only fit one, and they chose the terrible one, and we had to wait years to get the Frayling track. So this is the third in Frayling's commentaries for the Dollars trilogy, and just like the other two, he has his wonderful charm and energy and insights and knowledge of Leone, and he brings all of his years and decades of defending and championing Leone's artistry into this track. It's a blast of a listen. I've listened to this at least 15 or 20 times. It never gets old. It's one of the great commentaries. It is a joy to listen to, and it's the complete antithesis of how dull and boring and cranky and pointless the Schickel track is. So for one of the most iconic films ever made, you do have two all-time great commentaries, with the Tim Lucas one for the international cut and the Sir Christopher Frayling version for the long versions of the film. Then we have the deleted and alternate scenes gallery. These are all in 4K resolution with Dolby Vision HDR grading. They start with the Italian credits for the film, which are the iconic title credits, but with some slight differences in terms of credit placement, some of the color, and you do want to always try and preserve the original text credits for any foreign film, even if they are not used in the Restoration Master. So this was obviously completed and restored in 4K with Dolby Vision for the planned Italian release of the film, but since they couldn't do that, at least they were allowed to include their restoration of the original Italian credits for the deleted and alternate scenes gallery. Then we get the freeze frame for Tuco's introduction, but of course with the original Italian text. This Il Brutto freeze frame was of course seen in the original Letterboxd Laserdisc Master, because that did use big chunks or significant portions of an Italian print, but otherwise you would only see that on Italian versions of the film. This was obviously also completed as part of the restoration of the Italian version that they were not able to include, but each of the freeze frame captions in the original Italian version was included here in this gallery. We then have Angel Eyes Extended, which is essentially an extended version of Angel Eyes arriving at the homestead before the table confrontation. This has some additional shots and angles that had to be sourced from a collector's print in Canada, and this is the only known surviving source for these handful of additional shots that were removed in the final edit. So it's essentially a fascinating glimpse of not just a tiny bit of extra material, but also the editing process and how Leone went about building and reshaping his sequences. Then we have the other Italian freeze frames, and what's fascinating about the freeze frame for The Good is that it actually includes the original Italian mixing in terms of how the audio was mixed during that. Originally, there was no music. There wasn't the extra bit of music with the trill on the soundtrack. So you just have Tuco yelling in the desert and kicking the sand and stuff, and just the sound of the wind and the natural sound effects. So they realized apparently that it didn't play as well, and it certainly doesn't. It certainly helps having that extra little music cue there. So that's another fascinating inclusion. And the audio here was mixed in from a surviving 35mm preview print. And what's fantastic about these is that when it's necessary, they do have explanatory text and some images before and after, because all of these little scraps may not seem like much to people just looking at the runtimes, but each little bit is incredibly important, incredibly insightful in terms of how these sequences were finalized, but also helps to explain what's happened to the film over the years, because there are still ongoing mysteries about what happened to certain things and the preservation and presentation history. It's still not something that's been able to be 100% locked down, because there simply is not enough information or material. So to have anything survive is a miracle. Then we have the Bones in the Desert sequence, which is the reconstruction of the mostly surviving in picture and partial audio surviving extra bit during the desert torture sequence where Blondie falls into the bones, as I mentioned before, and gets the one shot out of his hand by Tuco. This does have quite a bit of damage and was only in various preview prints, but has been reconstructed as best as possible. Unfortunately, not all the audio survives, so we have most of it, but then there's one line of dialogue that has had to be included as a subtitle, and it's basically people making their best educated guess, because not all of the production materials survive to explain or to actually note what the dialogue was supposed to be. So it's an approximation, but it's incredible that we have any of this, because before it was basically just one of the things that we had a still of, because there are still various pieces of the film that we know were shot because all we have is one or two stills or a tiny scrap of footage in a trailer. So it's amazing that this has been able to almost entirely be reconstructed, and fantastic it's here in 4K resolution and has even been included in the full warts and all Easter egg cut of the film. Another fascinating inclusion for us fans is the Italian intermission cards have been included. This obviously was also intended for having a roadshow version in terms of branching options for had they been able to include the Italian cut of the film, which in its longer runtime did have a natural point for an intermission break, and this had a specific intermission made for it. So this comes at the point where Blondie passes out in the mission, and Tuco is obviously thus having to wait there by his side. We get the nice fade to black. That's where the intermission was placed originally, and then it fades back in with Tuco carrying the bowl of water and grumbling, and just before the meeting with his brother Pablo. So for the first time ever, we can actually see the original intermission, which are simple and very effective, red and black, to, I guess, kind of reference the original opening title cards with the black on red. But here it's in Italian, obviously, and it is what you would have seen on the original run in Italy for the intermission. So it comes up, fades out, then we get the second one for the start of the second half of the film, and then fades into a grumbling Tuco. Then this closes out with extended freeze frames and Tuco's final line from the Italian version. This shows and has explanatory text about how originally the final freeze frames were longer. Essentially, they play out in completion with the music cue, and when you look at them, they do seem a bit long, so it makes sense why they were trimmed, because having them shorter and cut together quicker, it adds a bit of humor to those, actually. But here, using preview print materials and other things, they were able to reconstruct and present the full original preview, essentially, extended versions of the final freeze frames. So again, it provides insight into the editing process, because you get to see how this final little iconic bit was originally put together. And then Tuco's final line in the Italian version was a separate shot from the English version, because they wanted to make sure that Eli Wallach's actual lip movements matched perfectly with the Italian dialogue, because the actual wording is significantly different from the English line. So that's why, if you ever saw the Italian versions of the film on an old VideoMaster or such, and you noticed it looked different on the final shot, it's because it was a different take. And so Eli runs up to the camera and yells the line in Italian. So we have that preserved here, and this is the only way we get the Italian in shot because, of course, they couldn't include the Italian version of the film. Now we turn to Disc 3, which houses the bulk of the exhaustive supplements plus the legacy extras. Again, this is a Region B locked Blu-ray, whether you've got the Blu-ray set or the UHD set. So do keep that in mind. If you've got the UHD set and you don't have region-free capability, you will unfortunately not be able to play Disc 3 unless you're able to play Region B locked discs. We start with the Circular Trilogy, which is essentially the third and final part of the critical overviews by critic Fabio Melelli, this time focusing particularly on GBU and how it rounds out the trilogy of films, which can also be seen as merely individual films that are variations on a theme with certain linkages instead of direct sequels. This gets into some really nice production details in addition to recounting some of the famous anecdotes about the film, and runs about 19 minutes. As with the rest of the new interviews, the speaker is Italian and there are nicely provided English subtitles. The only other thing I'll mention is that when you see the clips from the film that are used throughout the extras, like a lot of modern extras, sometimes the quality can vary a little bit because they're obviously sending files around to the people actually making the interviews and documentaries and pieces, and sometimes it will be an earlier version of a master, sometimes it'll be an older version of a master, and sometimes they can save a little bit of space by compressing the clips a little bit, so sometimes you might see a little bit of lesser image quality, but that's to be expected. There's only a flash of a moment or two of having a slight frozen grain effect, simply due to how film clips are typically handled in some of these. It's not in all of them, it's just only maybe 2 or 3 times it pops up throughout the whole extras, but I think that's to be expected now. It's pretty commonplace to see the clips from a new master or the clips from a film that are being used between talking head pieces, that you're going to see some variation, and it's obviously not meant to be as spectacular or as pristine looking as the actual restoration transfer on the feature disc. Then we get The Laughter Behind the Epic, which is an interview with Giacomo Scarpelli, the son of Furio Scarpelli, one of the film's co-writers. And so he talks at length for about 29 minutes about his father's career and also what it was like growing up as the son of one of the most famous screenwriters in Italy, how his father actually got to be writing GBU with his partner, how they developed their style over their career writing with one another, how their previous films influenced that. Also mentioning how just prior to GBU, how they were working on a project for Alfred Hitchcock that unfortunately never got made, which just sounds fascinating. But it's a great insight into the writing process of the film and the writing team's particular strengths and what they brought to the film, and how you can start to recognize their particular flavor and how that influences the film we love so much. And having the son of the screenwriter actually get to talk at length about his father and his father's career and how proud he was of his father's work and how that influenced him. It gives you that direct personal connection. And it's really fantastic that it's a piece that's not short. You know, this is basically 30 minutes. And so we get all kinds of personal insights and better details than we would had it just been only a couple minutes and only focusing on the one particular film. Next is Three Colors, an interview with Stefano Delicoli, the son of cinematographer Tonino Delicoli. And for 23 minutes, we basically get a similar style of interview with him talking at length about his father's career, how his father essentially was self-taught and worked his way up through the Italian film industry, how he met and befriended a young Sergio Leone when they were both working their way up in the film industry, and how they eventually came back together and he took over the photography for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Delicoli talks about his father's particular style and how that influences GBU, and that's why, of course, GBU has a different visual look and aesthetic to the first two films of the Dollars trilogy. So there is direct discussion about the difference between Massimo Dallamano's photography and Tonino Delicoli's photography, and of course how Delicoli's partnership with Leone continued in films after this. Again, because this is a lengthy personal interview, you get so much more detail about the person and the person's body of work than you would had it just been someone talking about their work on the film for a few minutes and not really getting into their career and what they were like as a person and what their tendencies and choices were in terms of their overall body of work. But you also get that personal touch of it being their son and having that experience of being with their father during their working days of their career. Next is Sergio and Sergio, a 27-minute interview with camera assistant Sergio Salvati. He goes into incredible details about day-to-day activities during the shooting of the film, his close relationship with Leone, and how them having the same first name caused some fun jokes on the set. He talks about the relationships he developed with some of the lead actors and how much he enjoyed working with them, and has still a wonderful love for the work they did on the film and its everlasting legacy. And in spite of his advancing years, he's still obviously incredibly proud of the film and enjoys talking about all of these various on-set memories. So to have that sort of direct connection and to get it in this level of detail from somebody who was actually there operating the camera and can actually recount how they felt during the infamous bridge explosion that happened too early, which of course necessitated rebuilding the bridge and blowing it up again to actually get it on film this time. That's the best explanation of the bridge story I've heard, because it was somebody who was actually there manning one of the cameras and trying to turn it over as fast as possible to at least catch some of the explosion that had already started. Like all of these interviews, I think it's interesting to note that for all the things we've heard about Leone over the years as perhaps being a little bit cold or not being personable, every one of these interviews completely lays that to rest, because they all display such affection and a wistfulness that he died at a younger age and that they just didn't have him in their lives anymore or didn't get to work with him again. So even after all these decades, you see this in all the interviews. You see this sort of light come on in their eyes when they think about Sergio Leone as a person, as a creative force and a vision, but also just as a person and a force in terms of his personality. Next is The Hand That Drew the West, which is a 6-minute additional piece with Giulietta Simi, the daughter of the great Carlo Simi, and she actually shows her father's original production designs, sketches, and even storyboard materials, but all of her father's original designs and materials for various sets and locations from the film. This includes the opening ghost town, but also the bombed out city being hit by cannon fire, and most of all of his designs for setting up the battle sequence and the bridge and the trenches, and of course the iconic Sad Hill Cemetery. And just seeing the image of his original sketches and designs for the cemetery and the circular pattern and the thousands of graves, it's enough to make any fan of this film just have to stop for a moment and completely marvel. So this is basically an additional piece to what we found on the incredible interview on the For a Few Dollars More disc, but this time focusing specifically on showing off some of Simi's original design materials for this film. Next we have They Called Him Angel Eyes, which is another interview with Lee Van Cleef biographer Mike Malloy. This runs about 12 minutes. It's basically part 2 of the first part interview on the For a Few Dollars More disc, where Malloy talks about Van Cleef's career after For a Few Dollars More, going into The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, the switch entirely from such a wonderful, heroic, tragic character in Colonel Mortimer to the total antithesis in Angel Eyes, or Sentenza as he's known in the Italian version, the person who's the physical manifestation of the final sentencing of death and seems to enjoy that role very, very much. This is another wonderful insight into Van Cleef's career at this point and where he would go after the success of this film and how that would further influence his screen image. He also describes one of the cut scenes that unfortunately no longer survives, but we at least have the stills of it. This is the scene where Angel Eyes and Blondie stop for a moment, and it's the image you see sometimes of Van Cleef with a loaf of bread that he's cutting in his hands. And they basically had another scene where the two characters sort of were trying to size one another up before getting to the rest of Angel Eyes' gang and continuing the story. He also mentions an interesting note from one of the tie-in novelization books. There was a series of novelizations for each of the Dollars trilogy and then a couple other books that really had nothing to do with the actual films. They were just branching off of the novelizations that had been written. And they seemingly had the original Italian scripts for the Dollars trilogy novelizations, because if you can find one of these incredibly rare books, which I really want to find because I'm dying to read them, they have a couple little tidbits, such as in the novelization of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It actually explains how the Angel Eyes character gets the Union Army uniform. It explains basically how he gets into his role in the Union prisoner camp, because if you stop and think about it, you have to wonder, well, how exactly did he get there? Did he, how did he get a commission in the army and such? So there are apparently a couple little tidbits like that in those incredibly rare paperbacks. So it's really nice to get a note about that here to once again remind us fans that we need to find those on eBay and hopefully not pay through the nose, but that even the very rare novelizations contain a few extra little pieces of material. Next is From Falls to Fame, which is an interview with actor and stuntman Fabio Testi. It runs about 14 minutes, and in his wonderful, charming way, he talks about his career, how he basically got into the world of Sergio Leone, how he was essentially to have had a bigger part in Once Upon a Time in the West, but that kind of got cut down, and so he's just kind of there as one of Cheyenne's gang. This doesn't necessarily have a whole lot to do with The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly in terms of the specific film, but it's another wonderful interview that gives great insight into Sergio Leone's working methodology and what he was like on and off the set of one of his films and his intensive focus. So I think it's a fantastic inclusion, even if it may not specifically talk about The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly directly. Next is The Man, the Cut, the Masterpiece, which is a 28-minute second interview with co-editor Eugenio Alabiso. This is just as good as the first interview on the For a Few Dollars More disc, but he gets to talk at length about the editing process of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly and how it became incredibly intensive, with Leone running back and forth between his two editors at Moviola's and basically locked in a room for the whole post-production period, and Leone running back and forth as they would cut one sequence at a time, and then they'd be cutting that while Leone would run back to the other editor and look at the other sequence he had been cutting and then run back and back and back and back. And Morricone was there as well. And so it was just this incredibly collaborative, hyper-charged post-production period where they were trying all sorts of different things and trying to get this massive film cut and actually finished in order to meet the December release date. He specifically talks about cutting the Ecstasy of Gold sequence and also how the final duel sequence was cut and how both editors' work had to match seamlessly together. He also talks about how he was the one who developed the idea for the final shot of the film and Tuco's final line trailing off into Morricone's score, with the yelling transitioning into the yelling of the actual music to end the film on a sort of jokey grace note. He talks about being on the set of the film, his relationship with Leone, how much he misses him and missed being able to work on more Leone films, and of course also the experience of seeing the film at the premiere, and just it's a wonderful source of even more firsthand details from someone who was actually there and actually had their hands on the film itself as the one who was actually cutting it with his co-editor, with Leone right there in the room. And once again, we get another mention of Leone's penchant for jangling his keys when he was thinking, or and basically being able to read his thoughts by how much the keys were jangling and then when they would stop. So it's fun getting another mention of that, because that's something you'll hear described quite a number of times across the various interviews. It must also be said that everyone still has a wonderful sense of humor and charm, and that comes across, and I think that helps to explain at least partly why these films are so iconic and so legendary and so timeless, because that goes into the film itself. Leone had some of that, but that sort of charm and energy being in so many members of the cast and crew can only, feed into the film itself, and that helps give it its energy and its real soul and its spirit. And that, I think, is part of why these films are so timeless and why we're so devoted to them. And so being able to hear directly from so many key personnel and recognize that same energy, it explains a lot. Then we have Frames of Glory, which is a 28-minute interview with the post-production supervisor, Enzo Acconi. And this is really, I think, the best of the interviews in terms of the wealth of detail, because this is the person who was brought in to oversee the post-production and make sure that it actually got finished on time. So this is the person who was there in the room with Leone Morricone and the two editors, and the one who was making sure things got done, and the one who had to know where all the materials were and what the status was every day, and oversee everything to ensure that the final dubbing, the sound mix, the final edit, everything was locked in so that they could make the premiere date, and then of course make the Italian release version before transitioning over into the production of the international version. And also dealing with United Artists and trying to figure out the cuts needed for the runtime to be reduced, and also trying to deal with the Italian censors to get the film a lower rating so they didn't limit the audience, and figuring out what might need to be cut, and also their attempts to make a slightly cut Italian version to actually get that lower rating. He describes the entire process in great detail, and also Leone's extraordinary focus and fixation on trying to get every detail as fully realized as possible, including the recording of new sound effects to try and have unique and striking sounds throughout his sound mixes, when that was something that most people were not really doing, and the concept of the actual term of a sound designer was still over a decade away. That wouldn't really appear until Walter Murch's work on Apocalypse Now. So it's, I think, the most revealing and information-packed of the interviews. And then on top of that, he also talks about some of the cutscenes and how, for whatever reason, some of those disappeared from the negative sources. And he specifically mentions things like the Bones in the Desert scene and the Grotto scene, and how those sort of came and went, but how mysteriously there are still questions about the elements of the film and things that are not 100% locked down. So even the post-production supervisor is kind of in the dark, like the rest of us fans and everyone obsessed with these films, that not everything is known and not all the elements are there, and who knows if they still exist somewhere. So if the post-production supervisor is in the dark like the rest of us, I guess it makes us fans feel a little bit better, I suppose. Next is That Magic Sound, which is the third and final part of the Bruno Diamario interview. This runs about 8 minutes, and Diamario talks specifically about his guitar work and other performances on the score for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, not to mention the recording sessions, and where his relationship was with Morricone at this time. So this is essentially the final part of that same interview session, and each part has been on each of the 3 releases, and this one is just as energetic as the first 2 parts, and the only problem is that it's just 8 minutes. You wish it was longer. Then we have The Voice Behind the Gold, which is a 14-minute interview with Etta Del Orso. So this is a second interview piece, along with what was on the For a Few Dollars More release. She talks specifically about her performances in GBU, her iconic vocal during the Ecstasy of Gold, how Morricone gave her freedom in her singing in terms of basically giving her various guidelines and having the music, but allowing her to just sing freely, even if she's not specifically singing actual words. It's the spirit and the intensity behind them, and how she would just let herself go. And she actually talks about losing her voice in terms of just how hard and how high she had been singing. And I guess it makes us non-singers feel a little bit better because we wonder how she can possibly hit these amazing notes. And then to hear from Del Orso herself say, oh, well, I did that and I lost my voice for a couple days or a couple weeks. It's like, oh, okay. Well, that makes sense, obviously, because it's such an astonishing performance. So it's another really wonderful, charming, down-to-earth interview, and she talks about her career and her personal life and her relationship with Morricone, and essentially, because she talks about where her career sort of went after the GBU score had been completed. And then she concludes by saying that she's amazed that her work is known the world over, and that it really touches her. And so I just found that really touching myself, because it's one of the iconic vocal performances. I mean, the Ecstasy of Gold is known pretty much the world over. Even if people don't know it's from the film or have never seen the film, they know that music and they know that incredible iconic vocal. And it's just one of the signature moments of the Leone canon. And just like you can't separate Morricone's music from Leone's vision, you can't separate Morricone's music from Eda Del Orso's incredible vocals. Then we have Call of the Coyote, which runs 28.5 minutes. This is part 3 of the interview with Morricone biographer and friend Alessandro De Rosa. He talks in this piece specifically about the GBU score, where Morricone had grown or evolved from his work on For a Few Dollars More, his continuing partnership with Leone, the post-production process, the development of the GBU score, and the themes for each character, along with the main title, and of course also talking about the Ecstasy of Gold and the final duel sequence. But also, of course, talking about the recording sessions, and then also, because it's part 3 of this total long interview, because the first 2 parts are on the other 2 releases, he also talks about his relationship with Morricone, how they met, and how that eventually led to writing his biography, and in terms of co-writing it. And it's also quite touching, because this is somebody talking about someone they met and had a sort of mentor-student relationship in a way, but also one that did genuinely cross over into a level of friendship and respect between one another, and then collaborating on actually telling his life story. And so it's really wonderful to get something that has all this wonderful information, but also that personal connection, again, just like all the other interviews, and getting past the myth or the image we have of great artists. And so this is, I think, one of the other great aspects of this release, that we get such a wonderful discussion of Morricone's artistry, but also a nice discussion of Morricone the person, and what it was like actually knowing and working with him, and also talking about, directly learning from him and becoming friends. So it's not something you get in your typical, oh, let's just talk about the score. So it's another wonderful surprise. And it's great that this is another at-length interview, because if you were to combine all 3 of these, you've got, well over an hour, and certainly feature length in terms of the overall discussion of Morricone's work and his experience on the Dollars trilogy. And then we close out the new supplements with The Good, the Great, and the Moody, which is nearly 29 minutes. It's the 3rd video essay by Lovely John, talking about the score in particular. So he's doing score analysis, and also some plot analysis and how that ties into Morricone's themes and how the score is woven through the entire film. This is done with a selection of great images and stills, and then concludes with a discussion of the actual soundtrack recording, the UA soundtrack album, and the various physical media releases, not to mention the re-recordings of the theme by the Hugo Montenegro Orchestra, and then culminating in discussing how the score was finally slightly expanded and remastered for the MGM 2003 edition, and then finally given the full royal treatment on the 2023 CD Quartet Records release and restoration, which is one of the finest soundtrack releases of all time, and certainly the release that you need in your collection if you were to have any of the releases of Morricone's works for the Dollars trilogy. This is the one that is the most important. Then we have all of MGM's legacy extras in their own section. These have all been ported over, so you don't have to hold on to any past releases, and even though they are all standard definition because they were done and released first on the old 2004 DVD, they have been properly upscaled and presented on this release, so there are no problems with frame rate, and yes, they're certainly noisy, and you can tell they were made back in 2003, but they look and sound as good as they can. And this is important because there are a number of fantastic interviews, especially with those no longer with us, and it's one of the only times there is actual interview footage of Clint Eastwood talking about these films and working on them. And there's also some great discussions about some of the cutscenes and other material that is not gone over in the new extras because it's already been discussed here. And talking about their technical presentation is very important because a number of past releases have not done a good job in presenting them. And so on some of the Kino releases, these have had some frame rate errors and were not encoded very well. So yes, they're older standard definition legacy extras, but that doesn't mean they're unimportant, and it doesn't mean you can ignore their presentation quality. So that's why I wanted to stress that these have been treated extremely well, and they are presented as best as possible on this Blu-ray disc. So when you go through all of these, if you haven't seen them before, it's essentially a miniature making of documentary, also talking about some of the anecdotes. There are interviews with a few critics, but primarily Richard Schickel and Sir Christopher Frayling, who had done the 2 commentary tracks. But the most important part of these, in terms of the interviews, is that you have recollections from Sergio Donati, Mickey Knox, Alberto Grimaldi, even Clint Eastwood, and Eli Wallach as well. So you've got that first-hand material, and from some of the iconic names of the film, and unfortunately some of them are no longer with us, so it makes these pieces even more important. So these include Leone's West, The Leone Style, Il Maestro Part 1 and Part 2, The Man Who Lost the Civil War, vignettes or Easter eggs. These are just little pieces that were taken out of some of the interviews, so it's a nice, cute little piece. But then we have the reconstruction of the Socorro sequence. This is basically using images, text, and music to describe the cut sequence from the film where Tuco tracks Blondie to the town of Socorro. This is where Blondie is seen in bed with a woman while Tuco takes over a Confederate's post who's basically begging for money. He sort of sees it as a scheme to make a fast buck and just barges his way in. And so we had another comic moment with Eli Wallach fleecing people of their money. And this is all a setup because he thinks he's got Blondie cornered, but he finds he's been duped and turns around to find his newly ill-gotten gains gone, but a smoking cheroot stub in his sombrero instead. And then, of course, the chase continues. So it makes sense why it was cut in terms of time and pacing, but one hopes that somewhere this survives in a vault somewhere so we can finally see this. But it is discussed some in the other new extras, but this is the specific older extra that actually explains the whole of the scene. And then we have the vintage extra called Reconstructing the Film, and this explains the process of the 2003 MGM extended English language version, shows what they did, and discusses the picture and sound, and you will be hitting your head against the wall if you know what this resulted in terms of the MGM 2003 version and then the video masters of that, and how it caused all kinds of new problems, even though it had the best of intentions. So this is one of those vintage extras where you watch it to understand the actual history of the presentation of the film, and this also explains why a lot of what Arrow did on this release is so important to basically go back and undo a lot of MGM's work, because it can be said that what Arrow has done on this release is basically what MGM should have done in 2003, and unfortunately for all of us fans and for the preservation of the film, they did not do. So yeah, it's taken quite a while, shall we say, to get to this point, but it's important to preserve even this, which documents where the film was at in 2002 when they were carrying out this process, and what the 2003 version actually was and how it was made. Arrow has also included 2 alternate credit sequences. So we have first the French opening and closing credits, which, like all the different languages of the film, have a few slightly different credit placements for the text and things. So it's fascinating to look at those and look at the timing. The quality is a bit low and soft and fuzzy in some places, so I'm not sure if this is an HD file or if it's a standard definition upscale. I kind of lean more towards it looks more like a standard def upscale, but it's still just a wonderful inclusion here, because very few, if anybody, will actually include the alternative foreign credits in terms of title sequences for films, because it's something that people just don't really think about, and this stuff, unfortunately, it typically doesn't survive, or doesn't survive in great quality. Then we have the original Spanish credits. This is only the opening credits, but it is in decent enough quality. It is in scope. It's a little cropped on the sides, but this one's definitely a standard definition upscale. The quality is lower than the French titles, but still, this is really important to have because there are some different credits and different credit placements in Lardani's iconic title sequence. So for a fantastic, iconic title sequence such as you have in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, having all the different foreign variations with different text placements, some different images, some slightly different edits, these are really important to have and preserve, even if it's only available in lower quality from an old standard definition source. So this is another really fantastic inclusion and something that I wish more people would do. Then we close out with the image galleries. These are more of superfan and fan historian and archivist Mike Siegel's pieces, where he creates these beautiful montages from his own personal vast archive of rare stills and original images from these films. These are beautifully edited pieces where one image flows into the next, and it's beautifully cut and sequenced to Morricone's score cues. Now, these were originally done for the Kino Lorber releases, but it looks like Siegel has done some new work on some of them, because some have the 2017 dates, but some of them seem expanded and carry a new 2024 date. So these are broken into 4. Each runs about 9 minutes in terms of length. The first is GBU in Pictures, parts 1 and 2. Each of these has 220 black and white original production stills and images, each containing some of the rare glimpses of the deleted materials. So we see images of the Socorro sequence, the Bones in the Desert sequence, the scene of the breaking of the bread between Angel Eyes and Blondie, plus plenty of glimpses of Leone in action as director, and some of the other famous faces in cast and crew, and especially all the wonderful candid in-between moments. We get even more of these in the gallery that's third, entitled On the Set, which is entirely on-set candid images and some promotional images of in-between setups and laughing between takes and all the wonderful things that we fans love to catch glimpses of. And then the last is Promoting GBU, which is a selection and a whole gallery of original posters, lobby cards, and press release materials from the different campaigns run by United Artists across the world. And nicely, this is broken up into the individual countries. So it'll show the American materials, the British materials, the reissue materials, the German materials. It'll just go through country and territory one at a time. Now we turn to disc 4, which is the Blu-ray of the documentary from 2017, Sad Hill Unearthed. Now this is the one disc in the set that is exclusive to the limited edition. So if you get the standard edition, you'll be able to get the same fantastic first 3 discs, but disc 4, like other Arrow limited sets that have exclusive documentary discs or bonus discs, this is the one disc that is exclusive to the set, and it's unfortunate because this is a fantastic documentary, and if you're a diehard fan of the film, you will want this great disc in your collection. So It's just one of those things that for licensing and cost reasons, they can't include all the discs in the standard version, so at least they were able to get all of the important materials and all of the new and legacy extras on the standard release, but it's just disc 4 that will not be included in the standard version. This is also a Region B locked Blu-ray, so if you don't have region free capability, you will want to actually get that, because this is a fantastic documentary and it's also got great supplements of its own, so this is just as well produced as the other discs in this set. So the documentary, Sad Hill Unearthed, is the main feature of disc 4, is of course focusing on the fan efforts to actually preserve and restore and resurrect the Sad Hill Cemetery set designed by Carlos Simi and built for the film in Spain during the original production. And this basically started as not only a grassroots efforts in terms of actually pulling this off and getting the manpower and the resources together and actually starting their own association to do this and preserve the site. But also, it's a grassroots sort of documentary because the director admits in the extras and things, it just started because he heard the story and wanted to get some footage of before they actually started the project. And it grew from there, because this documentary is not just about the project, but it's about the people actually feeling this compulsion to do this because of the film's impact on their lives and because of the film's legacy and what it means to so many people, and how this project involved people from so many different walks of life. And then the idea to put the online notices out and get more help and interest and support from even big names who are some of which are included in the interview pieces. And they actually managed to get some of the bigger names. They even managed to get interview pieces with James Hetfield of Metallica due to their usage of the Ecstasy of Gold as their iconic show opener. But actually getting Sir Christopher Frayling and most of all getting Clint Eastwood to actually do some interview portions, which he does not usually do, especially not about the Leone films. So those are just really remarkable to see for a documentary that was made with a lot of the same ethos of the actual restoration project of the site. And the most rewarding aspect of this is actually hearing the people's story, and what this means to them, and what it means for their personal lives, and how this felt like an impossible task. It started as a simple idea, and it developed, and it grew. Or I should say, to paraphrase El Indio, there was this crazy idea, and it stayed. And it stayed, but there was something he had to do. It's that sort of effort, and it's amazing to be able to see the whole process and the eventual results. And it's just really special that the documentary itself was made in a similar way, a project that grew and grew and grew. And then getting to the end and seeing the celebration they had for the film's 50th anniversary, and just seeing the emotions on the faces of everyone who had poured their blood, sweat, and tears into this project, and knowing what it meant for them. It's a very well-made documentary that is incredibly respectful of the film, but also one of the great documentaries about, fan efforts, really. And there's even a nice inclusion of the Sad Hill at Sad Hill film from the fine folks at Sad Hill Media, where they actually went to the site back in 2015 and tried to restage the final duel sequence while also reflecting on what the film had meant in their lives. So here I am watching this wonderful documentary disc in my home theater, and Devin Scott and Co. pop up on my screen. So that was a wonderful touch, and it was really nice to see the documentary also reflecting on other aspects of the fan culture around the Leone films, and using other pieces of material to show the scope of just how impactful these films have been to all of us. So it's a really well done documentary. It's an hour and 27 minutes long, so it is a full feature-length documentary. It did go to a number of festivals and won several awards. It is extremely well done, and just a wonderful love letter to to the fans who were behind this incredible project, which is still something you can look up and support and actually go and visit there. And I think it's been said that there's now talk about trying to actually restore the Betterville prison camp set as well. So this might be something that has spun off into trying to restore more of the incredible sets and Carlos Simi's original incredible designs. In terms of the presentation, this is in 1.78:1, obviously in terms of the aspect ratio. It was filmed using a variety of formats and uses various clips of differing quality, so that's to be expected in a documentary, that you'll notice some variations in the overall image just due to the different sources. But overall, it is very well produced and shot, and the disc is well mastered. The bitrate is at a constant, around 35 megabits per second. The sound is also very well done. It is presented in lossless 5.1 DTS HDMA and also a stereo track as well. Both are in Spanish with English subtitles, but then the English-speaking interviewees will obviously be speaking English, but the subtitles are very well done. The 5.1 mix itself is actually quite good, and there's a wonderful original score for this documentary that really fills out the sound space quite well. So even though it's just a documentary and a lot of the audio is just people talking or hearing the audio of everybody trying to dig up the actual cemetery site and excavation noises, it's quite well mixed for a documentary. So if you're watching this, you'll want to actually listen to it in the 5.1 track, which is not something you really get to do a lot in documentaries. So the fact that they actually made a solid 5.1 multi-channel mix of this documentary is another nice special little touch. In terms of the overall presentation of this disc, Arrow didn't skimp on this. This has a full maxed out bitrate for the documentary. We get the typical Arrow menu, but with a perfectly selected montage of clips from the actual documentary with the main theme of the documentary score. So it's got a full stylized menu specifically for the documentary. And then we even have a selection of quite substantial extras just for the documentary. The first is Lost in the Editing Room, which is 16 minutes of outtakes and unused portions of the various interviews. So this has extra pieces with original editor Eugenio Alabiso, extra pieces with Sir Christopher Frayling, extra pieces with James Hetfield and Joe Dante, but even an extra minute or so of the Clint Eastwood interview that was just not used in the final edit. So this has some nice extra little pieces of all the interviews. The next is another 16-minute piece. This is simply entitled A Making of the Documentary with the film's director, Guillermo de Oliveira. And while it's simply labeled a making of, and it's the director basically standing there and taking you through the whole process, this is one of the most no-frills, honest explanations of what you go through in terms of the ups and downs of starting a documentary project or really shooting anything in the modern age and having to do it all yourself, and what it takes, and learning the equipment and the formats and the software, and running into problems and having to figure out how to deal with footage you may have captured at a certain particular time and in a certain particular frame rate or format, and then having to switch over to another format or another camera or another style, and then having to figure out how to bring all this stuff together or convert material or make it work and make it match. And then the job of actually getting the interviews and trying to actually, even just trying to get to people. And that all of this started with just wanting to go to the site and get some images of what it was like before the work started, to sort of document the before and after. It started with just a simple idea like that. So it's a wonderful, wonderful insight into just the filmmaking process. So if you're somebody who's always dabbled in these things or wanted to do more, this is inspirational in that sense of letting you know more of the day-to-day in and out technical nitty-gritty of what it takes even just to make a documentary like this. And it makes you appreciate the documentary even more because it gives you what their whole process was and how they had to build this, and then getting a composer to write an actual score, and then doing the 5.1 mix of their documentary, and then getting it to actually be premiered, and not to mention getting all the rights clearances and how expensive and difficult that is. So this basically takes you through the whole process, and it's 16 minutes of just pure, this is what we had to do, this is what our journey was with this, and it's nice to see somebody actually take the time to do this and go through all the details, because it's not an easy thing to do. You have to have real commitment, and it takes a lot of time. It takes even more money that none of us really have. So it really makes you appreciate this whole documentary project all the more. Then we have a 15-minute interview with the composer Zeltia Montez about the score, the composition, and recording of it, and then even how it was mixed in 5.1 multi-channel. And this is another really nice interview because she gets into details about her thought and working process and making the score, and how it's a different sort of challenge making a score for a documentary, and you're just being given all this interview footage at the start, and how do you work with that and maintain a consistent sense of theme and mood, and how do you develop themes around interview pieces. So it's a really nice insight into modern score recording and composition, but especially for how you do it for a documentary, which is a whole different mindset than doing a score for a narrative feature. Then we have the world premiere of the film at the Tokyo Film Festival, and this is basically the question and answer session with the director and producer after the documentary. So it's what you typically expect at a film festival Q&A, where they're sitting at the front and in front of the screen in terms of the auditorium. It's 36 minutes. It's a nice discussion. Obviously, the quality is limited because it's just a camera in the auditorium and they've got hand microphones. It's a little bit longer because it's in Tokyo, so for each question and answer there has to be the translation, but still it's really nice to have this document of what the premiere screening was like, and also the questions asked are pretty good, and the responses add more insight to the documentary. But what I noticed that was really interesting is that I suppose this is something that they do in Japan at these, but when the audience goes to ask their question, they actually dim the lights, which I thought was a really interesting thing. It's almost as if it preserves the modesty of the person asking the question, and then they bring the lights back up once the audience member gets to sit back down once their question is over. And I have to admit, as somebody who's not the best in social situations, I really like that concept, because it's like you're no longer just put on the spot and you're trying to stammer out your question and not look like an idiot. So that was just something I noticed, because they did that for every audience question, and at first I was like, oh, did the lights go out? Because they dimmed and then they came back up. And then they did that for each of them. So I don't know if that's just something they do in Japan, but I really like that concept, I have to admit. And also I have to note that in spite of this just being, in audience camera basic setup of a Q&A session and limited quality, even this has a maxed out bitrate on this disc. So Arrow spared no expense. So even, just a standard Q&A session with a camera like just in the auditorium pointed towards the front, even this has a maxed out bitrate. And so does the final extra, which is Sad Hill in 2020. This is a revisit to the preservation site of the cemetery, basically showing an update 3 years after the documentary's completion. So we have one of the restorers that we got to know in the documentary basically walking us around the cemetery site in 2020, and it concludes with a final drone flyover shot of the entirety of the site at that point 3 years later. So it's a nice way to show what it's like after the documentary, and that the work still continues, and that they are preserving the site as was their original intention. So that concludes the contents of the limited edition of Arrow Video's restoration of Sergio Leone's masterpiece, and the conclusion of the Dollars trilogy, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, one of the most iconic masterworks of the cinema. Now, this goes beyond just being a physical media upgrade, and given that it has such substantial supplements and is a massive set and presents so many viewing options in terms of the cuts and editions of the film for all fans, and does its absolute utmost to undo the preservation and mastering mistakes of the past and undo decades of preservation problems. This moves beyond just being an exemplary release that fixes so many mistakes and allows you to replace or get rid of your whole shelf of editions of a film. This is the most special of the $3 trilogy releases that Arrow has done, simply because it's had to have the most work, and it has the most amount of supplements and the most amount of attention to detail, and the most effort has gone into this one because it had the most problems. It had the most things to overcome, the most hurdles and challenges, and also was the most notable in terms of those particular problems being well known and discussed, not just among videophiles, but among just the general fan base. I think it's pretty well known just how screwy and messed up the MGM 2003 extended version was, and then, of course, how that manifested over the years, and then came the appearance of the Rich Rivada 4K master with the hideous color grading and still using the terrible MGM remix, and in some forms included a very crummy sounding version of the original mono mix, and then how the Kino attempt to fix that actually kind of made it worse. And then on their second attempt, how they tried to address some of the mistakes of their first release. And while it was an improvement, it was by no means anywhere near comprehensive or fully accurate. It was basically putting a Band-Aid on the situation. But then you also have to go back and look at the film's entire history and look at the various problems and edits, and go back to the oddities of MGM's 1998 master of the international version, which was its own unique particular version because it was not the actual international cut. It had some tweaks and differences and some processing on the audio track. And then you go back to the 1990 release, which is almost the international cut, but not quite, because it's missing a few shots and frames, but that has the seemingly untouched audio from the source nobody knows, and is arguably the best option we have for the original English mono mix. But then you go back to even before that in the original analog era video masters with their quirks, and then how battered the surviving prints had gotten from various reissues, and the cuts that those had, and then the cuts in all other countries, and then the deleted materials, and how the Italian version has actually had variations and differences and different versions and different edits. So even that is difficult to pin down. And then the whole notion of the premiere version, including the Grotto scene, and then how MGM shoved that into their version, but then didn't reinstate the full entirety of the torture sequence. All of these things sort of intertwine in this never-ending mystery of trying to figure out the exact status of this particular film and what elements survive and how is it presented in different countries, because essentially, just when you think everything has been discovered, a fan will turn up something somewhere, or a new image will turn up, or a new still from one of the deleted sequences, or a tiny little scrap might appear in a trailer or a print somebody finds. So it's been truly important to have this documented, and it's really the fan historians and preservationists over the years who have led this charge. And thank goodness that they were able to participate in these releases and try to ensure that their research materials were joined with the official materials and the studio materials so that Arrow could be able to collaborate with everyone and make this as comprehensive as humanly possible. And even though I had just a tiny amount of input into this whole project, I at least feel better I was able to put my 2 cents in, even though it was extraordinarily minor compared to everyone else. But I just wanted to say again that this was a real collaborative effort. This is the type of thing that, frankly, needs to happen more often, because a lot of times fans are able to put in more time and resources even than people in studios, and also dig up things that aren't always necessarily going to be the official source or be from a vault, and it will be stuff that just simply doesn't exist anywhere else. It's very much the same sort of story that happened with film collectors, and so many rare and priceless materials and even entire films have only been saved and archived due to film collectors actually getting those materials and holding on to them, whether they knew it was the only copy in existence or not. It was due to their efforts to preserve materials in terms of just keeping it from being thrown in the trash heap or burned or destroyed or sold for scrap. Their efforts managed to preserve such a great amount of film history. Well, this is very much the same thing, and fan historians and preservationists do not need to be looked down upon by studios and official sources and such, because fan preservation work is incredibly important, even if it's entirely grassroots and having to be done simply due to a love of films and wanting to do a little bit more digging and starting to put two and two together and realizing that there is still much more work that needs to be done for certain films. So this Arrow release is the culmination of all of that, and the first time somebody has come in and tried to cut the Gordian knot of problems that are the preservation status of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, the most challenged of the Dollars Trilogy films, the film of the three that's had the most variations, the most cuts, the most versions, the most video masters, the most different approaches on home video masterings in terms of not just color timing, but audio presentation, audio remixes, and then the different edits done on different video releases. So this was the biggest of the three to tackle, not because it was the longest runtime necessarily, but because it had the most baggage that came along with it. So now there is finally one release that you can point to and say to someone who has never seen the film before, but maybe knows some of the iconic lines or knows Morricone's music, or they know the image of Clint Eastwood as the man with no name, or they kind of know about Sergio Leone, or they've never gotten into Westerns, but they want to see this film. You can point to the Arrow release and say, get that one. Just get that one. Of course, it is only available now in the standard edition, which has just come out. It is available at our fine import retailers, as it is a Region B release, since Arrow does not have the US rights. The limited edition sold out pretty much instantaneously, which is a shame because the overall package is fantastic, and it includes the wonderful Sad Hill Unearthed documentary disc with its great supplements. Thankfully, the standard edition has the all-important 2 feature discs and the crucial 3rd disc of extras. You, of course, lose the wonderful hardcase packaging and the incredible booklet and the nice poster, but the real downside of the standard edition is that they weren't able to also include the documentary disc. That's the most notable part that is exclusive to the limited edition. So I would encourage people who missed out on the limited set to perhaps keep an eye out on the used market, and maybe eventually prices might come down a little bit just so you can get the great documentary disc. But the standard edition is a must-own title. This is really the only release of the film you need in your collection. It goes so far beyond a physical media upgrade that just calling it a physical media upgrade is frankly an insult. This is a full-on restoration overhaul and has one of the most comprehensive packages of supplements for a single film you can possibly find. This is the level of care and attention to detail and adoration of an iconic film that The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly has always deserved. All past releases have left us a bit wanting in terms of these supplements. It didn't quite fully scratch the itch, if you will. But in terms of transfers, they drove us crazy. Even as good as the Kino UHD was, it was just putting a Band-Aid on the situation. It couldn't fully address things, and it only included the international cut of the film. And the only reason that disc was really any good is that concentrated efforts were made to sort of, fix up the Ritravada master with the time and budget and manpower they had, and actually working with fan historians and using their Laserdisc audio capture for the audio. But that release, frankly, was more of a placeholder, because now we have the full realization iteration of that basic idea, except Arrow has gone back to the raw scan files, done everything from scratch, and made this release as good as it possibly can be. No past release of this film has ever done that or gone to these levels, even including MGM's 2003 restoration attempt and the 35mm prints they made. And I've seen those, and this so completely outclasses even those. And the amount of work that has gone into this Arrow restoration project is so vast that they could put out a whole book on it, and frankly, I wish they would, because it was incredibly intricate, and just watching this release, you start to appreciate that. But when you get into the real nitty-gritty of this stuff and you look closely at the transfer and know about all of the history of the film in the past, it makes this truly, truly special, and one of those releases that seemed impossible. And so the impossible has finally been made possible on this Arrow release, which is, to date, the definitive release of the film on home video, and the only one you truly need in your collection. The only releases I would hang on to in terms of older versions, outside of just having nostalgia for, like, say, the 1998 version, would be the 1990 Laserdisc for its untouched PCM mono track that is crucial for preserving the audio fidelity of the original English mono mix, and perhaps the original CBS Fox master, which is exceptionally good for its time, and that is, of course, similar to the 1990 LD, but an even more hands-off presentation, just nowhere near as spiffed up as the 1990 release. But outside of those, you can replace everything else. If you have the Kino UHD and you're sort of on the fence thinking about, oh, well, it's a Region B title, do I really need to import it? I missed out on the limited edition. You need this. If you have any release of the film, you need this. If you like the film, you need this. If you love the film, why don't you have this already? Because it's that important. If you've ever been curious about the film and you've, for some reason, watched the entirety of this admittedly very long review, and I haven't convinced you yet of the importance of this release, trust me, you need this release. You need this release for any reason, because it is that stupendous. And even just as a physical media release, it is an incredible work and effort from everyone involved, from the presentation to the new supplements, to the presentation of the legacy supplements, to the packaging, to the artwork, to the extras, to the disc encoding, to the HDR, to the presentation of the sound, to the Blu-ray presentation, to the UHD presentation, to the presentation of the supplements disc. It is a class effort all around, the type of which you wish every physical media release could be, but unfortunately isn't. It's a shame it's taken us this many decades and this many video issues and quirks and presentation issues to get to this point with such an iconic film, but we're finally at that point. We have finally gotten to the final duel in the video cemetery and uncovered the gold of the Arrow release. So as always, I hope my babblings about the incredible works of Sergio Leone, timeless masterpieces of the cinema like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and the efforts of the wonderful folks at Arrow Video has been at least somewhat fun and informative. Please, if you are even at all remotely interested in this film, get the Arrow Standard Edition on UHD or Blu-ray. It is a stupendous release that is made to be as good as physically possible with the elements and materials that survive. This replaces virtually every video release of this film in the past, and you never really need to bother with any other edition of the film ever again. Even if this means you need to get a region-free player to be able to play Region B titles, this is a release you do that for. Region-free capability is quite easy to get and achieve nowadays. It's far less expensive than it was in the DVD era, and I think any serious cinephile or film collector should be region-free, because it opens you up to so many incredible import titles that are done to an incredible level of care and quality. But this release is so stupendous that it's one of those truly special titles that should encourage anyone to go region-free. And simply put, as someone who has spent most of their life researching this film and its video editions and its seemingly never-ending presentation history, I still feel like I'm dreaming. I have to pinch myself to, actually believe that this exists and is a real thing in my hands, and I can now revisit this whenever I want to, and no longer have to deal with making my own patchwork video affair of all the flawed and screwy editions of the past, trying to use the best elements of all of those. So this is just a wondrous release. It is the most special of the Arrow Dollars Trilogy releases, simply due to the magnitude of this release. And on top of that, having all of the supplements and different versions that they've managed to pack in here, and never once sacrificing the quality of the release or the disc encoding. So attention to detail is found in every single aspect of this release, and it is one of the great physical media releases. It belongs in every collection and is just marvelous. It is a release to marvel at. So as always, please do keep supporting both boutique and studio labels by buying films on disc in order to support incredible restoration and presentation efforts like Arrow's work on the Dollars trilogy, and also to help keep film culture itself alive. And as we Leone fans get to now ride off into the sunset of having a beautiful presentation and preservation of the iconic Dollars trilogy, I just want to say, as always, thank you ever so much for watching.